Newcomb's Paradox. Would you choose one box with $1 million or two boxes, risking getting less? Imagine you're standing before two boxes labeled A and B. Box A is transparent, and inside it you see a guaranteed $1,000 0 cents. Box B is opaque. You can't see inside. But here's what you've been told. A highly reliable predictor, almost infallible, has already placed either $1 million, 0 cents, or nothing in Box B. If the predictor foresaw that you would take only Box B, it placed the full $1 million 0 cents inside. But if it predicted that you would take both boxes, A and B, it left Box B empty. Now the choice is yours. Do you take only the opaque Box B and potentially walk away with $1 million? Or do you take both and settle for $1,000? Or possibly $1,001,000, 0 cents, if by some miracle Box B still contains the jackpot? This is Newcomb's Paradox, one of the most mind-bending decision-making problems ever devised. It tears apart the seams of free will, prediction, causality, and rational choice. Philosophers, mathematicians, and economists have debated it endlessly, each camp drawing its own conclusions, each more paradoxical than the last. To understand it is to step into a world where logic splits into branches, and where what seems obvious is endlessly open to interpretation. Let's begin with the logic of dominance, the traditional tool of rational decision theory. From this standpoint, it seems clear. No matter what the predictor has already done, Box B either contains $1 million, 0 cents, or it doesn't. So why not take both boxes? If B is empty, you still walk away with $1,000, 0 cents. If B contains $1 million, 0 cents, you get that plus the extra 1,000. Taking both boxes appears to dominate taking just one. That's the reasoning many people lean toward instinctively. It's the cold, calculating move. Take both. Maximize your gain. But then there's the other side, the side of expected utility. The predictor, you are told, is almost always right. Its track record is virtually flawless. People who take only Box B almost always walk away with the million. People who take both typically end up with the smaller sum. So what if, instead of focusing on what's already in the box, you focus on what your choice says about the prediction that was made? In this case, the expected utility of taking only Box B, given the near-perfect prediction, is actually higher. Statistically, your best shot at the million is to pick just the opaque box. Strange, isn't it? By choosing only one box, you seem to retroactively influence what's already inside it. Here lies the paradox. Your decision feels like it should be forward-facing. Taking both boxes seems to give you more, yet the very act of choosing tells you something about what the predictor must have already done. It's as if your decision is entangled with the past, connected by a chain of prediction so strong it warps causality. And in that tangled web, your free will becomes a variable in a complex feedback loop. Do you truly have freedom to choose, or are you merely playing out the role the predictor expected? Some theorists attempt to untangle this by distinguishing between two kinds of decision makers. The first is the causal decision maker. This person believes that since the contents of Box B are already fixed, they should take both boxes and maximize whatever payout lies ahead. The second is the evidential decision maker. This person believes that their choice is evidence of what the predictor likely saw and acted upon. Since choosing only Box B correlates with higher payouts, they act accordingly, even if it feels like the predictor's decision happened in the past. This philosophical tension gives rise to deeper questions. What does it mean to cause something? Can a decision in the present influence an event in the past? Of course, in physics, causality doesn't run backward. The past is fixed. But Newcomb's paradox isn't about physical time, it's about psychological time. About prediction, belief, and expectation. In this paradox, you're not just confronting a decision, you're confronting an echo of yourself, refracted through the mind of a near-omniscient forecaster. Now imagine applying this thinking outside the thought experiment. Consider relationships, career choices, or moral decisions. Sometimes you face situations where your choices reflect more than your immediate logic. They reveal your character, your tendencies, your values. People around you predict your moves. Systems anticipate your actions. Algorithms shape your options based on your patterns. And sometimes, by acting differently, by choosing unpredictably, you alter the outcome not because of direct causality, but because your behavior changes the system's expectation of you. In this way, Newcomb's paradox becomes a metaphor for life in a world of constant surveillance, data prediction, and algorithmic feedback. There's also a layer of existential weight here. What if everything about your future could be accurately predicted by a sufficiently advanced intelligence? Would your choices still be free? Or would you merely be acting out a script written in probabilities and patterns? This question echoes ancient debates about fate and determinism, modern concerns about AI and big data, and even theological quandaries about omniscient gods. If the predictor is perfect, are you really free? Still, Newcomb's paradox refuses to hand you a simple answer. It splits the world between one-boxers and two-boxers, each camp armed with logic and rationale, each convinced of their intellectual superiority. One-boxers trust the system, betting on the reliability of prediction. Two-boxers trust logic, maximizing immediate gain. And each group views the other as making a critical mistake. The paradox endures not because it's unsolvable, but because it reveals something unsolvable within us. Our conflict between logic and intuition, freedom and prediction, self-interest and belief. Newcomb's paradox is more than a thought experiment. It's a mirror that reflects our inner divisions, our competing views of reality, and the paradoxes we live with every day. Do we act based on what we see, or based on what might be? Do we trust in the systems we're a part of, or break free from them? Do we seek control, or do we accept the mysterious interplay between choice and consequence? So, what would you do? Take both boxes, or trust the prediction and walk away with just one? Your answer may say more about you than you realize, and in this strange dance between belief and logic, perhaps the real prize isn't in the box at all. It's in the way we learn to question the rules of the game itself. The prisoner's dilemma. Two prisoners are offered a deal: betray or stay silent. Trust vs logic. What wins? Picture this. Two individuals, both accused of committing a crime together, are arrested and placed in separate interrogation rooms. They can't communicate. Each is offered a choice by the authorities. If one betrays the other, confesses and testifies, while the other remains silent, the betrayer walks free, and the silent one gets a heavy sentence. If both betray each other, they each get a moderate sentence. But if both stay silent, they'll both serve only a light sentence due to lack of solid evidence. The setup is simple, but the implications are anything but. This is the prisoner's dilemma, one of the most iconic paradoxes in game theory and behavioral science, revealing profound truths about trust, self-interest, and the nature of human cooperation. At first glance, it might seem easy. Just stay silent, right? If both prisoners stay loyal, they get a minimal sentence. But there's a catch. Each prisoner must make a decision in isolation, uncertain about the other's choice. From a purely logical standpoint, betrayal appears to be the safer bet. Here's why. If the other prisoner stays silent and you betray them, you walk free. And if they betray you, then your betrayal reduces your sentence. Either way, betrayal minimizes your risk. This logic leads both prisoners to choose betrayal, and ironically, they both end up with a worse outcome than if they had cooperated. Logic, in this case, fails to deliver the optimal result. This is where the paradox unfolds. Rational individuals acting in their own self-interest end up in a situation where they both lose. It's a contradiction that stings because it reflects real-world situations far beyond the prison cell. It's not just about law and crime. The prisoner's dilemma is everywhere, in politics, relationships, economics, business, and even global diplomacy. Think of two rival companies choosing whether to lower prices. If both do, they hurt their profits. If one does and the other doesn't, the one who drops prices may gain market share. If neither does, they both maintain stability. Yet, fear of being undercut often drives both to act aggressively. The logic that seems protective becomes destructive. On the surface, this is a game of strategy, but underneath, it's a test of trust. And that's what makes the prisoner's dilemma so deeply human. It exposes the fragile balance between cooperation and competition. It asks, when faced with uncertainty and risk, do we trust others or act to protect ourselves? The dilemma holds a mirror to our deepest fears: fear of betrayal, fear of being made a fool, fear of vulnerability. It also reflects a core tension in society, the push and pull between individual gain and collective good. Game theory classifies the prisoner's dilemma as a non-zero-sum game. That means both players can win or both can lose. Unlike zero-sum games where one's gain is the other's loss, the prisoner's dilemma opens the door to mutual benefit, but only if both choose to cooperate. That's the beauty and the tragedy of it. Now imagine this game isn't played once, but repeatedly. This is called the iterated prisoner's dilemma. Over multiple rounds, patterns emerge. Players learn from each other. Trust can be built or destroyed. In this longer-term version, cooperation tends to emerge more often. Strategies like tit for tat, where a player starts by cooperating and then simply mimics the opponent's previous move, have been shown to outperform more aggressive, exploitative strategies. This teaches a powerful lesson. In ongoing relationships, trust and reciprocity often yield better results than ruthless self-interest. But even in iterated games, trust is fragile. One betrayal can reset the balance, poisoning future cooperation. This mirrors real life in profound ways. In marriages, friendships, business partnerships, or international treaties, trust takes time to build and seconds to shatter, and once broken, it's difficult to restore. The prisoner's dilemma reminds us that while logic may urge caution, our survival often hinges on connection and mutual belief in each other's goodwill. Some thinkers argue that the dilemma offers insights into morality. Why should you do the right thing when it's risky? Why be loyal, generous, or kind when the world might punish you for it? The answer, according to the dilemma, is that mutual cooperation offers a deeper kind of reward, one that sustains communities, relationships, and civilizations. If we all acted purely in self-interest, society would collapse into mistrust and conflict. But when we choose to cooperate, even in uncertainty, we create a world that is more just, stable, and humane. And yet, the dilemma doesn't offer easy comfort. It doesn't suggest that trust always wins. In fact, it acknowledges that trust is dangerous. To stay silent while the other betrays you is to risk being taken advantage of. The fear of that outcome is often too great. This emotional complexity, the fear, the hope, the weighing of risks, is what makes the prisoner's dilemma such a rich and enduring thought experiment. It captures the fundamental tension between our rational minds and our social hearts. Modern applications of the dilemma extend far beyond theory. In international relations, countries face versions of the prisoner's dilemma all the time. Consider arms races. If both nations disarm, peace prevails. If one disarms and the other doesn't, the disarmer is vulnerable. If both arm up, tension and danger escalate. Here, as in the prison cell, mutual distrust leads to mutual harm. In environmental issues too, countries or corporations often face a dilemma: reduce emissions together for collective benefit, or prioritize short-term gains while others bear the cost. Again, the temptation to defect undercuts the possibility of shared prosperity. The dilemma even reaches into the digital world. On platforms flooded with competition for attention, creators, advertisers, and influencers face the question: collaborate and uplift each other, or compete aggressively and monopolize engagement? The logic of survival often drives selfishness, but communities that foster collaboration often see more sustainable growth. What's remarkable is how this paradox, developed through game theory, touches something primal and psychological. It's not just about logic, it's about identity. Are you the type of person who cooperates or defects? Do you believe in people or do you hedge your bets? The prisoner's dilemma doesn't just ask what you'll do, it asks who you are. The prisoner's dilemma forces us to ask, can trust survive in a world designed to reward betrayal? Can logic and empathy coexist? The answer is complex, just like human nature. In one-shot interactions, betrayal often wins, but in the long run, in communities, in families, in societies, cooperation is what keeps us going. It's not always the safest move in the short term, but it's the only one that builds something lasting. So, two prisoners sit alone, each weighing their options. One may betray, one may stay silent, or maybe both choose to cooperate. In that quiet moment, a timeless drama plays out, one that echoes in every boardroom, every election, every act of forgiveness or suspicion. The prisoner's dilemma reminds us that while trust is fragile, it's also essential. And sometimes, the most rational thing we can do is to believe in each other. The lottery paradox. Each lottery ticket is likely a loser, but one must win. How can all be unlikely, but one must be? Imagine you're looking at a stack of lottery tickets, thousands, maybe millions of them. Each one is numbered, identical in appearance, differing only in the chance it represents. You pick up a ticket and examine it. Statistically, it's almost certain to lose. In fact, you could say that about every ticket in the pile. The odds are stacked against each one. It seems rational to believe that each individual ticket will not win, but here's the twist. You know with certainty that one of them must. That's the paradox. The lottery paradox confronts us with a strange collision between probability, belief, and certainty. It challenges how we make judgments, how we trust reason, and how we define rational belief in a world full of uncertainty. Let's break it down. Suppose there are 1 million lottery tickets and exactly one will win. If you were asked for each individual ticket, will this one win? Your answer would likely be no. The odds are 1,000,000 to 1. It would be unreasonable to believe that any specific ticket will win. So you declare each ticket a loser one by one. And yet, when you've gone through the whole pile, you've ended up believing something you know is false, that none of them will win. But that contradicts the very rules of the lottery. One must win. Somehow you've arrived at a collection of highly reasonable individual beliefs that, taken together, form an unreasonable and self-contradictory conclusion. This is the lottery paradox. It's not just a game of numbers, it's a deep exploration of logic and epistemology, the study of knowledge and belief. The paradox shows us that what seems rational in isolation can become irrational in aggregate, and that is both unsettling and profoundly relevant to how we navigate daily life. It's easy to assume that if every individual belief is justified, then the set of those beliefs must also be justified. But the lottery paradox shatters this assumption. It shows that rationality, when stretched across many tiny certainties, can fold into contradiction. The problem lies in the way we handle belief and probability. We often operate with the rule that if something is very likely, we can reasonably believe it to be true. So we say, this ticket probably won't win, so I believe it won't. But when we apply that belief across all tickets, we end up with a belief set that must contain a falsehood, because believing that every ticket will lose is the same as believing that none will win, which contradicts the rules of the lottery. The implications reach far beyond gambling. This paradox reflects a recurring issue in everyday reasoning. Consider the medical field. A doctor might assess dozens of symptoms and, for each one, reasonably conclude that it's not a sign of a serious illness. Each conclusion is statistically justified, yet the patient ends up with a rare disease that one of those overlooked symptoms pointed to. Each individual assumption made sense, but collectively they failed. The same goes for intelligence gathering, jury decisions, financial forecasting. In complex systems, we often deal with 1,000 little probabilities. And yet, certainty, real certainty, is rare. The lottery paradox reminds us how easily a house of justified beliefs can lead to a fundamentally flawed conclusion. There are philosophical responses to this paradox, each with their own costs. One approach is to deny the principle that says you can believe something just because it's very probable. Maybe you shouldn't believe that each individual ticket will lose, only that it's very likely to. This means replacing belief with credence or degrees of confidence. Rather than saying, I believe this ticket won't win, you might say, I'm 99% confident it won't. This avoids committing to an absolute statement and allows you to hold many high-confidence beliefs without contradiction. But this comes with a price. We're forced to abandon the clean, binary idea of belief. We now live in a world of probabilities, shades of gray, and uncertainty. This can be intellectually satisfying, but emotionally uncomfortable. Most of us like our beliefs to feel firm, not fluid. Another approach is to say that it's acceptable to believe each ticket will lose as long as you don't combine those beliefs into one about the entire set. This treats belief like a fragile thing that breaks if overextended. But this solution feels artificial. If I believe every individual ticket will lose, how can I not believe that all will lose? It seems like a denial of logic to say that you can believe something about every part but not about the whole. This tension sits at the heart of the paradox. There's also a broader lesson here, one about the nature of knowledge. We often treat knowledge as additive. We assume that if each individual piece is solid, then the entire structure must be. But the lottery paradox tells us that truth doesn't always scale that way. In reality, belief and knowledge are context-sensitive. The sum of many reasonable beliefs can still lead us astray. That's a humbling thought. It shows that rationality is not just about logic, it's also about perspective, coherence, and knowing when individual reasoning leads to collective absurdity. This paradox also plays out in digital systems. Consider artificial intelligence trained on large data sets. It might assess each data point with high confidence, but when it tries to draw conclusions from a vast pool of highly probable but not certain inputs, it can produce flawed predictions. The system might believe too many things at once, falling into a version of the lottery paradox. Here, the abstract becomes concrete. The paradox is not just a quirky idea, it's a real constraint on how we design algorithms, how we train models, and how we interpret uncertainty at scale. But beyond logic and machines, the lottery paradox speaks to something deeply human. We live in a world of probabilities. Every day, we make decisions based on likelihoods, not guarantees. We assume the car will start, the elevator will work, the stranger won't lie. These assumptions are reasonable, even necessary, but we must remember that reasoning from probability is always a dance with uncertainty. The paradox warns us not to confuse what is probable with what is certain, and not to build castles of belief on sand just because each grain seems solid. It also reminds us of the dangers of overconfidence. When we deal with large sets of beliefs, whether about people, politics, or events, we must be careful. Just because every piece seems trustworthy doesn't mean the whole picture is right. This is especially true in our modern information landscape, where beliefs are constantly being shaped, shared, and reinforced in echo chambers. The lottery paradox asks us to hold our convictions lightly, to recognize the limits of probability, and to remain open to the idea that certainty may be an illusion. At the heart of the paradox is a profound tension between what we feel is reasonable and what logic demands. We want to trust our intuitions, our assessments, our individual judgments. But when we step back, we sometimes find that those judgments lead to impossible outcomes. That dissonance is uncomfortable, but it's also enlightening. It teaches us humility, caution, and the value of stepping back to see the whole. The lottery paradox doesn't ask us to stop believing. It asks us to believe more wisely. It encourages us to rethink the rules we live by, to examine how we draw conclusions, and to see that even perfect logic can produce imperfect truths. So the next time you hold a lottery ticket, or a belief that feels nearly certain, remember this paradox. Remember that even the most rational path can twist into contradiction, and that sometimes the key to wisdom lies in accepting what reason alone can't resolve. The Sorites Paradox. The Heap Paradox. Remove grains of sand from a heap. At what point is it no longer a heap? Imagine a heap of sand lying on the ground, a sizable mound, clearly distinguishable from its surroundings. Now, imagine gently removing a single grain from the heap. Surely, one grain cannot make the difference between a heap and a non-heap. The mound still looks like a heap. Remove another grain, still a heap, and another, and another. Each time, the change is imperceptible. Nothing in your vision or judgment feels altered enough to justify a categorical shift. But keep going, grain by grain. At some point, you're left with just one grain. No one would call this a heap, and yet every step along the way seemed reasonable. Every decision to still call it a heap felt valid. So when exactly did it stop being one? That's the Sorites Paradox, a simple thought experiment with profound implications, exposing how vague concepts defy precise boundaries and challenge the logic we rely on to define the world. The paradox gets its name from the Greek word Sorites, meaning heap. It was first recorded by ancient Greek philosophers like Eubulides, who used it to illustrate the problems that arise when dealing with vague predicates. Words are categories that don't have a sharp, well-defined edge. Terms like heap, bald, tall, rich, and old are common examples. Each of these concepts exists on a spectrum. There's no exact number of hairs that makes a person bald, no universal height that turns someone from short to tall. And yet, we use these words every day with confidence until we're asked to define their limits. Then, they begin to slip through our fingers like grains of sand. What makes the Sorites Paradox so powerful is how it plays on this gradual erosion of meaning. It reveals a contradiction between two seemingly plausible ideas. First, removing a single grain from a heap does not destroy its heapness. Second, repeat that enough times and the heap will eventually disappear. These two principles, when taken together, create a logical tension. If each individual step preserves the heap, how does the whole process result in its destruction? The paradox doesn't just reveal ambiguity. It shows how our intuitive reasoning can lead to absurd conclusions when applied systematically. There are various attempts to resolve the Sorites paradox, each highlighting different philosophical approaches to vagueness and language. One such approach is to reject the idea of precise boundaries altogether. This view accepts that heap is inherently vague, and that there is no single point at which a heap ceases to be a heap. Instead of looking for a bright line, it proposes that we should think in terms of degrees or gradation. A mound of sand doesn't suddenly stop being a heap, it becomes less of a heap over time, like colors blending into one another or a sunset gradually fading to dusk. The transition from heap to non-heap is a continuum rather than a binary switch. This idea is compelling, but it introduces a new set of problems. If heapness exists on a scale, how do we measure it? Can we say that a certain amount of heapness is required to justify using the term? And if we introduce degrees of heapness, how do we apply this framework consistently to other vague terms? This approach seems to replace one kind of imprecision with another, but it still offers a more nuanced view of reality, one that aligns better with the way we actually experience gradual change. Another approach is known as epistemicism. This theory asserts that there is a precise point where the heap stops being a heap, we just don't know what it is. In this view, the vagueness is a product of our ignorance, not of the world itself. According to epistemicism, there exists a particular grain of sand such that removing it changes the status from heap to non-heap, even if we can never identify it. This preserves classical logic and allows for precise boundaries, but at the cost of sounding counterintuitive. After all, how can something so minute and imperceptible carry such a weight of meaning? Still, another solution lies in the use of fuzzy logic, a mathematical system that allows truth values to exist on a spectrum between 0 and 1 rather than being strictly true or false. In fuzzy logic, the statement, "This is a heap," might be 0.9 true when the mound is large, 0.5 true as it becomes smaller, and 0.1 true as it approaches a single grain. This model reflects the ambiguity we encounter in real life and provides a flexible way to handle vague concepts. But it also changes the way we think about truth itself, shifting it from something absolute to something relative and context-sensitive. The Sorites paradox also invites us to consider the power and limitation of language. Language is a tool for categorization, for drawing lines in the chaotic complexity of the world. But those lines are often arbitrary. They serve social, functional, or communicative purposes, not logical precision. The word heap doesn't exist in nature, it exists in our minds. It's a label we apply for convenience, to make sense of messy reality. The paradox arises not because the world is flawed, but because our labels are. And yet we need these labels. We need to talk about heaps, baldness, richness, and old age, even if we can't define them precisely. This tension between necessity and imprecision is at the heart of the Sorites paradox. It reflects a broader truth about how humans think. We crave certainty, but we live in a world filled with ambiguity. We want to believe that concepts have clear edges, but most of the things we care about are fluid, evolving, and context-dependent. The paradox doesn't just apply to heaps of sand. It applies to moral dilemmas, legal definitions, medical diagnoses, and everyday judgments. When does a habit become an addiction? When does a flirtation become infidelity? When does childhood end and adulthood begin? These questions, like the Sorites paradox, resist clean answers. And yet we must choose. We must make decisions. We must draw lines, even when the lines feel arbitrary. In law, for example, the definition of legal adulthood might be set at 18 years. But is a person fundamentally different the day before and the day after their 18th birthday? No. The change is administrative, not existential. Still, society functions because we agree to uphold these artificial distinctions. The Sorites paradox reminds us that our categories are useful fictions, necessary for order, but always vulnerable to philosophical challenge. The paradox also has emotional and existential dimensions. It prompts us to question identity, change, and the passage of time. Consider aging. No single day makes you old, but one day you wake up and realize that youth has slipped away. Or think about relationships. Love may fade gradually, not all at once, yet at some point, you realize it's gone. The Sorites paradox captures this slow, invisible erosion of what once seemed solid. It reminds us that change is often imperceptible in the moment, but unmistakable in retrospect. So, what do we take away from this ancient riddle? Perhaps the greatest lesson is humility. Humility in our judgments, humility in our language, and humility in our pursuit of truth. The world is not built in black and white, it's shaded in gray. Our concepts are tools, not truths, and while logic can reveal contradictions, it can't always resolve them. Sometimes the answer to a paradox is not to eliminate it, but to live with it, to accept that some boundaries will always be blurry, that certainty, like the heap of sand, dissolves grain by grain. The Sorites paradox isn't just a puzzle about semantics. It's a profound reflection on the limits of reason, the nature of identity, and the beauty of ambiguity. It invites us to look at the world not with frustration, but with curiosity, to embrace the slow transitions, the undefined edges, the quiet shifts that shape our lives. Because in those spaces, in the uncertain middle between heap and no heap, we find the truth of human experience, not in absolutes, but in the paradox itself, the Bootstrap Paradox. You send a book back in time. The person who receives it publishes it. Who wrote it? Imagine you're holding a book, an old, worn volume filled with intricate ideas, groundbreaking theories, or perhaps a best-selling novel that shaped an entire generation. Now imagine this. You didn't write it. You found it years ago. It inspired you, it changed you, and eventually you sent it back in time, maybe through some futuristic machine or by handing it off to someone who had access to such technology. That book then lands in the hands of a person decades in the past. They open it, read it, and decide to publish it. It becomes a success. It's the same book you once found, but now you're left with a mind-bending question. Who actually wrote it? This is the Bootstrap Paradox, a temporal riddle that breaks the boundaries of linear thinking and challenges the very idea of origin. Named after the idea of pulling oneself up by one's bootstraps, it's a paradox about time loops, causality, and the strange consequences of information or objects existing without a clear point of creation, a book that exists simply because it was passed from future to past and back again. A piece of knowledge or invention that never had a moment of inception, and the implications are more than just academic. They strike at the heart of how we understand reality, creation, and identity. Let's walk through it carefully. Imagine a scientist in the year 2120 who stumbles upon a blueprint for a revolutionary piece of technology. Let's say it's a teleportation device. Inspired, they build it, refine it, and change the world. Years later, they send the blueprints back in time to their younger self, or perhaps to a predecessor in the year 2020. That person receives the blueprints, recognizes their brilliance, and publishes them, starting the timeline anew. The same document that inspired the future now exists in the past, and again in the future. So, where did the idea actually come from? There's no clear origin point. The blueprint, the idea, the creation, exists in a self-contained loop. It wasn't invented. It wasn't discovered. It simply was. The knowledge appears to generate itself, trapped in a causal circle with no beginning and no end. This is what makes the Bootstrap Paradox so deeply perplexing. It violates the very principle of causality, that every effect must have a cause, that nothing can come from nothing. In fiction, the Bootstrap Paradox shows up frequently. A character goes back in time with a song, a poem, or a piece of technology. The Beatles never wrote yesterday. A time traveler brought it to them. Shakespeare didn't pen his sonnets, he was handed them by someone who had already read them. Or a future inventor only creates what they had already seen from the past. Each time, the loop closes with no clear origin. The information becomes unmoored from any author or inventor, and while it may make for compelling science fiction, it also raises unsettling philosophical questions. The paradox suggests that certain ideas or objects could exist in a kind of informational limbo, neither invented nor discovered, but simply cycling through time, and that destabilizes the very foundations of authorship, creativity, and knowledge. If you write a novel because you were inspired by a copy of that same novel you received from the future, did you really write it? If you build a machine based on schematics sent to you from a future in which you had already built it, are you an inventor or just a messenger? But the implications run deeper. At its core, the Bootstrap Paradox exposes a flaw in how we perceive time. We often view time as a linear sequence, a straight line from past to present to future. In this view, causes precede effects, and every event flows from the one before it. But time, as described by modern physics, especially in the realm of general relativity, is not necessarily linear. Time can be curved, warped, even looped under the right condition, and this opens the door to closed, time-like curves, paths through space-time that allow for time travel to the past. In such a loop, the past and future become entangled in strange and sometimes paradoxical ways. This doesn't mean such time travel is practically possible, at least not with current technology or understanding, but the mathematical models suggest it could be under extreme conditions, such as near-rotating black holes, or using hypothetical constructs like wormholes. And if those pathways exist, even in theory, then so do the paradoxes that accompany them. Some scientists and philosophers have proposed ways to resolve the Bootstrap Paradox. One is the Novikov self-consistency principle, which states that any actions taken by a time traveler were always part of history and therefore must be self-consistent. According to this principle, paradoxes like the bootstrap are not contradictions but rather fixed loops that were always part of the timeline. If you send the book back in time, it's because you received it in your own past. The loop may be strange, but it's stable. There's no contradiction because the timeline is complete and unchanging. Others suggest that paradoxes like this point to the need for multiple timelines or parallel universes. In this view, sending the book back doesn't change your own past. It creates a new branch of reality where the book appears as if by magic, and history unfolds differently from that point forward. This resolves the paradox by removing the loop. Each action births a new timeline, and causality remains intact, though at the cost of introducing infinite reality. But even if these are mathematically or conceptually possible, they don't resolve the emotional and philosophical disquiet the Bootstrap Paradox creates. It forces us to confront the limits of knowledge, to question the origin of ideas, to ask whether authorship is meaningful when time itself becomes a collaborator. And in a way, that's what makes this paradox so haunting. It doesn't just challenge our understanding of physics, it challenges our understanding of ourselves. Because the Bootstrap Paradox isn't just about books or inventions, it's about identity. If you are shaped by something you never created, if your thoughts are echoes from a future you didn't yet live, what does that make you? Are you the originator, the receiver, or just a conduit? The paradox blurs the boundaries of creation and reception, making it impossible to tell where influence begins and ends." End quote. In a broader sense, the paradox can be seen as a metaphor for how knowledge and culture actually work. Ideas rarely have a single point of origin. They evolve, are passed down, reinterpreted, reshaped. A philosopher may be inspired by an ancient text, write a new theory, which is then read and interpreted again centuries later. Who then owns the idea? Who wrote the truth? The Bootstrap Paradox simply dramatizes this eternal exchange in the language of time travel. So, who wrote the book? The one you found, the one you sent back, the one that inspired someone to publish it? The uncomfortable answer may be no one. Or perhaps everyone. The book exists because it exists, trapped in a causal loop where creation is distributed across time rather than anchored in a single moment. And that realization doesn't diminish its power, it deepens its mystery. The Bootstrap Paradox teaches us to be wary of linear thinking. It invites us to explore the strange folds of time, identity, and causality. And it reminds us that not all answers have origins. Some questions are loops, not lines. Some stories, like the book that was never written, are self-made, existing because they exist, defying explanation and inviting wonder. So next time you hold a book, or listen to a piece of music, or stare at a technological marvel, consider this. Maybe what you're experiencing isn't just the product of a mind in a single moment. Maybe it's a loop, a ripple echoing back and forward through time, and maybe the story of who created it isn't a story with a beginning, but a paradox with no end. Zeno's Paradox. A. Achilles and the Tortoise. How can Achilles ever overtake the tortoise if he always has to reach where the tortoise just was? Picture a race in the ancient world. The mighty Achilles, swiftest of all Greek warriors, stands poised to compete against a humble tortoise. To make things fair, the tortoise is given a head start, a modest distance ahead on the track. Once the race begins, Achilles bolts forward with unmatched speed. It seems obvious he will overtake the tortoise in seconds. But then comes the paradox. By the time Achilles reaches the point where the tortoise started, the tortoise has moved forward, albeit just a little. When Achilles reaches that next spot, the tortoise has inched still farther. This process repeats endlessly. Achilles is always closing the gap, but never quite eliminating it, because he must always arrive at where the tortoise was, not where it is. Thus, according to this reasoning, Achilles can never actually overtake the tortoise. This is Zeno's paradox. At first glance, it feels absurd. In real life, we know Achilles would quickly surpass the tortoise. Yet Zeno's argument is not about physical speed, it's about logic, division, and the nature of time and space. What makes this paradox so enduring isn't that it disproves motion, but that it exposes the hidden complexities in our understanding of it. It forces us to confront deep philosophical questions about continuity, infinity, and the very structure of reality. The core of the paradox lies in the idea of infinite divisibility. When Achilles tries to catch the tortoise, he must first reach the tortoise's starting point. By the time he does, the tortoise has moved ahead. Achilles must then reach that point, and again the tortoise moves forward. This sequence continues infinitely, an endless series of smaller and smaller distances Achilles must cover. Each segment is shorter than the last, yet there are infinitely many of them. And how, Zeno asks, can one complete an infinite number of tasks, even if they're each brief? Zeno's paradox dates back to the 5th century BCE and was one of several arguments he posed to challenge the coherence of motion and change. His teacher Parmenides believed that all change was an illusion, that the universe was one unchanging, indivisible whole. Zeno's paradoxes were designed to support this view by showing that the common-sense notion of movement leads to contradiction. The Achilles and the tortoise scenario, in particular, became a classic illustration of how reason and experience can conflict. To resolve this paradox, we must dive into the mathematics of infinite series. Suppose the tortoise starts 100 meters ahead. Achilles runs 10 times faster. By the time Achilles reaches the tortoise's starting point, the tortoise has moved 10 meters farther. Achilles then covers that distance, and the tortoise moves 1 more meter. This continues, 0.1 meters, then 0.01, then 0.001, and so on. The sequence of distances Achilles must cover, 110, 1, 0.1, 0.01, is infinite, but it forms what's called a geometric series. And here's the key: infinite sequences can have finite sums. The total distance Achilles runs to catch the tortoise is the sum of an infinite number of increasingly smaller distances. Mathematically, this series converges, that is, it approaches a limit. In this case, the sum of the series is a finite number, just over 111 meters. Achilles covers this distance in finite time, overtakes the tortoise, and wins the race. Real-world motion, it turns out, is entirely consistent with the idea of infinite divisibility, as long as we understand how convergent series work. But the paradox doesn't disappear so easily. Because Zeno's point is not simply about arithmetic, it's about the logic of motion. He forces us to ask, what does it mean to move through space? If space can be divided infinitely, does that mean movement consists of completing an infinite number of steps? And if time is similarly divisible, does that mean every action involves an infinite number of temporal intervals? These are not trivial questions. They reach into the foundations of physics and philosophy alike. Modern science provides further insights. In the realm of classical physics, both time and space are treated as continuous, smooth, and unbroken. Motion is described with calculus, the very tool created to resolve problems like Zeno's. Calculus, developed by Newton and Leibniz in the 17th century, is built on the concept of limits, precisely the mathematical idea that allows infinite series to yield finite results. With calculus, we understand that Achilles overtakes the tortoise not in an impossible infinity of steps, but in a finite time interval. However, quantum physics introduces new wrinkles. At the smallest scales, reality may not be infinitely divisible. There could be a smallest unit of space, called the Planck length, and a smallest unit of time, called the Planck time. If space and time are quantized, the infinite regress Zeno describes might not actually exist in the physical universe. Instead of an endless sequence of smaller steps, there could be a fundamental limit below which further division is meaningless. This idea supports a kind of discrete reality, one made not of smooth lines, but of indivisible building blocks. And yet, even if space and time are not infinitely divisible in the real world, Zeno's paradox retains its philosophical power. It challenges us to distinguish between our conceptual models and the physical world. It forces us to recognize the difference between the map and the territory, between the way we represent motion in our minds and the way it unfolds in nature. Our intuitions are often based on simplified, linear ideas, but Zeno reminds us that beneath those surface impressions lies a much more complex structure. Moreover, the paradox echoes in other domains of thought. In psychology, we encounter a kind of Zeno's trap in the pursuit of goals. You aim to improve, to get closer to a target, financial, personal, creative, but the goal always seems just ahead. Like Achilles chasing the tortoise, you reach one benchmark only to find another. The progress is real, yet the finish line always recedes. In ethics, too, we might confront Zeno-like arguments, where incremental steps toward justice, truth, or reform seem endless and insufficient, despite steady advancement. The Achilles and the tortoise scenario also mirrors philosophical dilemmas about decision-making. If every action is divisible into a chain of smaller steps, do we ever truly act, or are we trapped in analysis? The paralysis by analysis effect reflects the anxiety Zeno articulates. If every decision has an infinite number of components, how can one ever choose? Yet in life, as in the paradox, the answer lies not in halting the process, but in trusting the convergence. We act, not because we have resolved every division, but because movement happens, one step, then another. Zeno's paradox doesn't stop motion. It doesn't prevent Achilles from overtaking the tortoise, but it reveals how difficult it is to explain motion using pure logic. It shows that intuition and reason can come into conflict, and that resolving such conflict often requires new frameworks of thought. In Zeno's time, the tools to solve the paradox didn't yet exist. Today, we have calculus, quantum theory, and a deeper understanding of infinity. Yet the paradox still invites reflection on how we define motion, on how we perceive time, and on how we deal with the infinite in a finite life. The paradox is not a roadblock, it's a doorway, a challenge to look deeper. Achilles overtakes the tortoise not because Zeno is wrong, but because the world is more subtle than our first impressions. Motion is real, but so is the mystery within it. Zeno helps us see that. His paradox reminds us that beneath the simplest events lies a world of thought, one where movement is not just a path, but a question. And in chasing that question, like Achilles chasing the tortoise, we move forward, always forward, even through infinity. The Omnipotence Paradox. Can an all-powerful being create a rock it cannot lift? This question, deceptively simple and profoundly disarming, lies at the heart of what is known as the Omnipotence Paradox. At first glance, it may sound like a playful riddle. Can an all-powerful being create a rock so heavy that even it cannot lift it? But beneath the surface, it hides one of the deepest philosophical challenges to the very idea of unlimited power. It's a puzzle that has stirred the minds of theologians, philosophers, and thinkers for centuries, not because of its literal imagery, but because of the conceptual tension it reveals, a tension between logic, power, and the very definition of what it means to be omnipotent. To grasp the gravity of the paradox, imagine a being that is said to be omnipotent, capable of doing anything and everything. This being can bend the laws of nature, reshape time, create universes, and destroy them with a thought. There are no limitations, no boundaries, no ceilings to its might. And yet, when posed with the question of whether such a being could create a stone it cannot lift, the mind halts. If the answer is yes, then there is something the being cannot do, namely, lift the rock. If the answer is no, then again there is something the being cannot do, create such a rock. In both cases, the being seems to encounter a limitation, and thus cannot be truly omnipotent. The paradox appears to trap omnipotence within a self-contradictory loop. This paradox doesn't arise from any flaw in language. It stems from the clash between logic and the concept of limitless power. It asks us to define omnipotence, not just in terms of greatness, but in terms of coherence. Is omnipotence the power to do anything, even the logically impossible? Or is it the power to do all things that can logically be done? And if the latter, does that count as true omnipotence? Philosophers have taken different approaches to resolve this tension. One approach is to redefine the scope of omnipotence. Thinkers like Thomas Aquinas argued that omnipotence does not include the power to do the logically impossible. According to this view, contradictions are not tasks, they are meaningless combinations of words. Creating a square circle, making 1 + 1 = 5, or constructing a rock that an omnipotent being cannot lift are not actual things to be done. They are incoherent. Therefore, God's inability to perform them does not count against omnipotence. Omnipotence, in this light, means the ability to do all things that are logically possible. This idea preserves the integrity of both logic and divinity. It avoids the absurdity of demanding that an all-powerful being engage in conceptual nonsense, but it also narrows the definition of omnipotence. No longer is it about doing everything, it's about doing everything that can be meaningfully done. And here we find a subtle shift. Omnipotence is not absolute in the way a child might imagine it. He is bound, not by weakness, but by the necessity of coherence. Another interpretation comes from viewing the paradox as a test of linguistic boundaries rather than metaphysical ones. The sentence, "Can an omnipotent being create a rock it cannot lift?" contains an implicit contradiction. It asks us to conceive of a being that is both able and unable in the same breath. It's akin to asking whether a bachelor can be married or whether a circle can have corners. The problem is not in the power of the being, but in the shape of the question. It's a category error, blending concepts that cannot logically coexist. Some modern philosophers extend this reasoning further, suggesting that omnipotence must be understood relationally rather than absolutely. In this view, power is meaningful only within contexts. An omnipotent being, by definition, holds maximal power relative to all other beings and all possible tasks within a logically coherent framework. The rock paradox becomes irrelevant because it attempts to define power as self-defeating, a challenge rooted not in strength but in contradiction. Yet the paradox continues to provoke because it forces us to ask deeper questions about the nature of God, or of ultimate power more generally. If a being is defined as unlimited, but that definition must exclude contradictions, then is it truly unlimited, or have we simply redefined omnipotence to make it safe from paradox? Some critics argue that this redefinition dodges the problem rather than solving it. By qualifying omnipotence, by saying it does not include the power to violate logic, we may preserve coherence, but at the cost of watering down the grandeur of the original claim. Others suggest that perhaps the paradox reveals something more profound, that power without limits may not be as desirable or as meaningful as we think. If omnipotence includes the ability to act irrationally, to negate its own abilities or to undo itself, then perhaps it ceases to be power in any meaningful sense. True power, they argue, includes wisdom, coherence, and self-consistency. A being that is self-defeating is not powerful, it is unstable. In this light, the paradox becomes a test of conceptual clarity rather than a flaw in divinity. Interestingly, some thinkers embrace the paradox as a feature, not a bug. In certain theological traditions, the mystery and contradiction of omnipotence are not seen as problems to be solved, but as expressions of the divine's transcendence over human logic. To us, the idea of creating a rock that cannot be lifted seems absurd, but perhaps to a truly transcendent being, such absurdities are not only possible, but meaningful in ways we cannot grasp. In this mystical reading, the paradox becomes a doorway into the ineffable, an invitation to surrender the limits of reason and embrace the mystery of the infinite. This perspective, while poetically rich, also comes with its risks. If we allow omnipotence to override logic entirely, we risk falling into incoherence. If anything can be true, then everything becomes meaningless. If God can be both able and unable at the same time, then no statement about God holds firm. This is the danger of embracing paradox without constraint. It unravels the very language we use to speak about reality. And so we are left in a delicate balance. The Omnipotence Paradox does not disprove the idea of an all-powerful being, but it demands that we think carefully about what such power actually entails. It challenges the naive conception of power as brute force and instead points us toward a more nuanced, coherent, and more profound understanding of greatness. Omnipotence, it seems, is not the power to do anything in the wildest sense, but the power to do all things that are meaningfully possible within the framework of reason and reality. The paradox does not silence belief, nor does it destroy the concept of omnipotence. Rather, it refines it. It teaches us that even the most exalted ideas must be examined, tested, and understood not just emotionally or spiritually, but philosophically. It invites us to consider that the true mark of omnipotence may not be the power to defy logic, but the power to create a world so rich, so intricate, so bound by rational beauty, that even the paradoxes within it serve a... So, can an all-powerful being create a rock it cannot lift? Perhaps the better question is, can we learn to ask the right kinds of questions? Questions that honor both mystery and reason. Questions that reflect not just what we want power to be, but what power must be to remain true. That, in itself, may be the most profound paradox of all, the Barber Paradox. A barber shaves everyone in town who doesn't shave themselves. Who shaves the barber? At first glance, this puzzle sounds like a quirky thought experiment, a peculiar rule wrapped in a simple town scenario. But hidden within its innocent phrasing lies a deep and unsettling contradiction. The Barber Paradox, famously introduced by the British logician and philosopher Bertrand Russell, isn't just about facial hair or barbershop etiquette. It's a razor-sharp riddle that cuts into the very heart of logic, self-record, and the foundations of set theory. The question is short and sharp. In a town where the barber shaves everyone who does not shave themselves, and only those who do not shave themselves, who shaves the barber? To grasp the tension, let's break down the rule. The barber has a very specific job. He shaves all and only those men in town who do not shave themselves. That means if a man shaves himself, the barber does not shave him. If a man does not shave himself, the barber shaves him. Simple enough. But now the question turns inward. What about the barber himself? If he does shave himself, then according to the rule, he must not shave himself, because the barber only shaves those who do not shave themselves. But if he doesn't shave himself, then he falls into the category of people who do not shave themselves, and therefore he must shave himself. In both cases, a contradiction arises. Whether he shaves himself or not, the outcome contradicts the original condition. The system collapses under the weight of its own logic. This is not just a clever trick, it's a genuine paradox. It reveals how self-resolving systems can break systems that seem logically airtight. And that's exactly what Russell intended. The Barber Paradox was not designed to confuse barbers. It was created to highlight a fundamental problem in mathematical logic and set theory that had troubled thinkers for decades. It was Russell's way of illustrating what became known as Russell's paradox, a discovery that shook the foundations of mathematics at the beginning of the 20th century. At the time, mathematicians were building systems based on set theory, the idea that all mathematical objects could be understood as sets, collections of other objects. But what happens when you allow a set to contain itself? Russell realized that if you define a set as the set of all sets that do not contain themselves, you end up in the same loop as the barber. Does this set contain itself? If it does, then it shouldn't. If it doesn't, then it must. This paradox revealed a serious inconsistency at the heart of naive set theory. A system that assumed any definable collection was a valid set. The Barber Paradox takes that abstract mathematical problem and gives it a more intuitive human form. It shows how rules that seem perfectly clear can produce contradictions when they are turned inward. It's not about barbers at all, it's about the limits of language, logic, and the systems we use to structure truth. And once you see the paradox, you start to see versions of it everywhere. Self-direction is a powerful but dangerous tool. In language, logic, mathematics, and even in computer science, allowing something to refer to itself can quickly lead to circularity and contradiction. Consider the famous liar paradox. This statement is false. If the statement is true, then it must be false. But if it's false, then it must be true. Like the barber's dilemma, it creates a loop that cannot be resolved within its own terms. So, what do we do with paradoxes like this? Some philosophers and mathematicians have proposed that the problem lies in the way the situation is defined. Perhaps there is no such barber. Perhaps the rule is simply incoherent and cannot exist in the real world. In this view, the paradox exposes the need for clearer definitions and stricter boundaries in logical systems. In mathematics, this led to the development of more refined versions of set theory, like Zermelo-Fraenkel's set theory, which avoids self-referencing sets and thus sidesteps Russell's paradox altogether. Others suggest that the solution lies in stepping outside the system. The paradox cannot be resolved from within the language or structure that created it. It points to the necessity of a meta-language, a higher-level framework where self-expression can be managed or avoided. This idea is echoed in Gödel's incompleteness theorems, which showed that in any sufficiently powerful formal system, there are true statements that cannot be proven within that system. Gödel used a form of self-notion to demonstrate the limits of mathematics itself. In a way, the Barber Paradox is a gateway into this deeper territory, a signpost pointing to the boundaries of what logic can hold. And the implications go far beyond math. In philosophy, the paradox invites us to consider the limitations of self-acknowledge and self-degradation. Can a person fully understand themselves using the tools of their own mind? Can a community govern itself without contradiction? Can a rule apply universally, including to the rule maker? These are echoes of the barber's dilemma, resonating through law, ethics, politics, and psychology. Even in everyday life, we encounter paradoxes of self-reflection. Think of someone who says, "I always lie." If they're telling the truth, then they must be lying, but if they're lying, then maybe they're telling the truth. Or consider systems of power that claim to regulate all others, including themselves. When authority turns inward, contradictions often emerge. The Barber Paradox reminds us that circular logic is not just a curiosity. It can be a source of instability and confusion wherever it appears. So, who shaves the barber? The answer is that such a barber cannot exist, not within the terms of the rule as stated. The very definition leads to a contradiction. The paradox teaches us that not every rule, not every definition can be consistently applied, especially when it refers back to itself. And this lesson is a powerful one. It shows us the necessity of precision in logic, the danger of unchecked self-reference, and the subtle beauty of paradox in revealing the limits of thought. The Barber Paradox may seem like a simple word game, but it reveals a profound truth, that the foundations of reason are not always as firm as they seem, and that sometimes, to move forward, we must examine not just what we believe, but the very language and logic we use to believe it. In doing so, we discover that paradox is not the end of understanding, it's the beginning. It invites us to look closer, to think deeper, and to question the structures we often take for granted. And in that questioning, we find the very essence of philosophy itself, the Grandfather Paradox. If you go back in time and kill your grandfather, how were you born to go back? Time travel is a concept that has fascinated humans for generations. We've dreamed about it in stories, explored it in films, and even studied it in physics. But woven into this alluring idea is a trap, a puzzle so mind-bending it threatens to unravel the very logic we use to understand cause and effect. The grandfather paradox stands as one of the most iconic and troubling dilemmas in the philosophy of time. It begins with a simple scenario. Imagine you travel back in time and, whether by accident or intention, prevent your grandfather from ever meeting your grandmother. Maybe you kill him. Maybe you just interfere with their relationship. Either way, the result is the same. Your parents are never born, and thus, you are never born. But if you were never born, how did you go back in time to interfere in the first place? And if you never went back, then your grandfather lived, and your parent was born, and so were you. And that means you did go back, and the loop begins again. This is the grandfather paradox, a self-contradictory loop of causality that challenges not just the logic of time travel, but the foundations of identity, existence, and the direction of time itself. It exposes a deep tension between our desire for narrative coherence and the logical consequences of messing with the past. Because if the past can be changed, and that change prevents the present from occurring, we're left with an impossible scenario, one where cause cancels effect, and effect erases cause. The paradox isn't limited to grandfathers, of course. It can be phrased in countless ways. If you go back and destroy the invention of time travel, how did you use it to go back? If you prevent a catastrophe, what motivated you to stop it in the first place? But the classic version remains iconic because it cuts straight to the root of personal existence. It forces you to grapple with the absurdity of undoing the conditions that made your own actions possible. To understand why this is such a problem, we need to look at how causality works. In everyday life, events follow a linear order. The past leads to the present, which leads to the future. This order is so ingrained in our thinking that we rarely question it. You plant a seed and later a tree grows. You knock over a glass and it breaks. Causes always precede effects. But time travel breaks this chain. It introduces the possibility of effects that influence their own causes. It flips causality on its head, and in doing so introduces logical contradiction. In physics, especially under the framework of Einstein's theory of relativity, time is not a universal constant. It can stretch, contract, and even loop under certain conditions. The idea of closed time-like curves, paths through space-time that return to their starting point, exists as a mathematical possibility. These curves suggest that time travel to the past could be possible under extreme conditions, such as near rotating black holes, or within hypothetical structures like wormholes. But even if the equations allow it, the grandfather paradox reminds us that the implications are anything but straightforward. So how do we resolve this paradox? Several theories attempt to answer that question, some by rejecting time travel to the past entirely, and others by reframing how time itself works. One popular approach is the Novikov self-consistency principle, which asserts that any action taken by a time traveler was always part of history. According to this idea, the timeline is self-consistent and cannot be changed. If you go back in time, you may try to kill your grandfather, but circumstances will always conspire to prevent it. Maybe your gun jams, maybe you hit the wrong man, maybe you're arrested before you can act. Whatever happens, the universe protects its timeline from paradox. You were always part of history, and history includes your failure to alter it. This theory preserves logic but at the cost of free will. It suggests that your actions in the past are constrained by what has already happened. You can travel back, but you can't change anything in a way that would produce a contradiction. In this view, the past is not a writable book, it's a film reel, already played, and your role in it is already defined. Another solution is the many worlds interpretation, which suggests that every action creates a branching timeline. In this view, when you go back and kill your grandfather, you don't change your own past, you create a new one. In the original timeline, your grandfather lived and you were born, but in the new timeline, he dies and you are never born. These timelines coexist as parallel universes, and your journey between them does not violate causality. You simply shift from one version of reality to another. This solves the paradox by eliminating the contradiction, but it introduces a dizzying complexity. If every choice spawns a new universe, then reality is constantly fracturing into infinite variations. And while this might be mathematically elegant, it challenges our sense of a unified self. Who are you if there are countless versions of you, each with different memories, experiences, and outcomes? A more conservative answer is to say that backward time travel is simply impossible. The Grandfather Paradox, under this interpretation, is not a puzzle to be solved but a warning sign, a demonstration that the past cannot be altered without collapsing into contradiction. This view aligns with our everyday experience of time as irreversible. You can remember the past, but you can't go there. You can plan for the future, but you can't visit it. Time moves in one direction, and the paradox is simply proof that trying to reverse it leads to absurdity. Yet, even if time travel to the past is impossible in practice, the Grandfather Paradox remains philosophically and imaginatively compelling. It touches on more than just science fiction. It speaks to our relationship with history, memory, and identity. What would it mean to change the events that shaped us? How tightly are we bound to the past? Are we the products of a fixed history, or do we carry the seeds of change within us? The paradox also highlights the delicate balance between determinism and agency. If we can't change the past, then perhaps the future is also fixed. But if we can change things, even hypothetically, then what does that say about fate? The Grandfather Paradox doesn't just question time travel, it questions whether time itself is an unbroken chain or a mutable river. In storytelling, the paradox serves as a metaphor for unintended consequences. It reminds us that tampering with one moment can ripple across generations. The desire to fix the past is universal, whether to prevent pain, recover love, or correct a mistake. But the paradox warns us, such changes might unmake the very person who desires them. The hands that reach back could erase the arms that reach forward. It's a poetic, almost tragic idea that our longing to reshape history could obliterate the self who remembers it. The Grandfather Paradox is not just about time, it's about the fragility of existence. It shows us that our presence in the world is the result of countless prior conditions, any one of which, if altered, could change everything. It reminds us that causality is not just a chain of events, but a web of interdependent moments that define who we are. And, in exploring that web, even through paradox, we deepen our understanding of what it means to be human. So if you went back and killed your grandfather, could you still be born to make the journey? According to logic, no, but according to imagination, you just might. And in that tension between reason and wonder, between cause and contradiction, we find the true power of the Grandfather Paradox. Not as a problem to be solved, but as a mirror held up to time itself, reflecting the mystery of how anything, including ourselves, can ever come to be. The unexpected hanging paradox. A man is told he'll be hanged on a surprise day next week. He concludes it can't happen. It does. Imagine a judge tells a prisoner, "You will be hanged at noon on one weekday next week, but the execution will be a surprise. You will not know the day of the hanging until the executioner arrives at your cell." The prisoner, alarmed but analytical, begins to think through the problem. He tries to deduce which day the execution could possibly occur, and in doing so he comes to a surprising conclusion. It can't happen at all. Yet when the day comes, perhaps a Wednesday or a Thursday, he is indeed hanged and utterly surprised. Thus unfolds one of the most perplexing and unsettling logical riddles of modern philosophy: the unexpected hanging paradox. This paradox is a fascinating blend of epistemology, the study of knowledge, logic, and the limitations of human prediction. The prisoner's reasoning appears airtight, and yet it leads him into a trap. How can an execution that seems logically impossible still occur, and worse, occur in precisely the way he was promised, with complete surprise? Let's walk through the prisoner's logic. He begins with the final day of the week, Friday. He reasons that he can't be hanged on Friday, because if he's still alive by Thursday night, he'll know that Friday is the only remaining day, and the execution would no longer be a surprise. Therefore, Friday is eliminated. Now, with Friday ruled out, he turns to Thursday. If he makes it to Wednesday evening without being hanged, he would again know that Thursday must be the day. So Thursday is also eliminated. The same reasoning eliminates Wednesday, Tuesday, and finally Monday. Step by step, the prisoner concludes that no day in the week is possible, because in each case, the hanging would no longer be unexpected. By this logic, the hanging cannot occur. Yet, suppose he is hanged on Wednesday. He wakes up that morning, believing he has escaped the paradox. He is confident that the execution will not occur, because his reasoning has already ruled out every day. And yet, when the executioner arrives, he is genuinely surprised. The hanging takes place, and the judge's condition, that it would be unexpected, is fulfilled. The paradox reveals itself in full. The very logic that seemed to protect the prisoner ensured he would be completely unprepared. So what happened? Where did the reasoning fail? One of the most intriguing aspects of the unexpected hanging paradox is that the prisoner's logic is valid at each step, but the conclusion is still false. This suggests that the problem lies not in logic itself, but in how we define knowledge, prediction, and surprise. The prisoner assumes that if he can logically deduce the day of his execution ahead of time, then the element of surprise will be lost, and the hanging cannot occur. But that assumption creates a loop. The more confident he becomes that the hanging cannot happen, the more vulnerable he becomes to being surprised. At the heart of this paradox is a confusion between two kinds of knowledge: deductive certainty and practical expectation. The prisoner believes that by ruling out each day, he has logically eliminated all possibilities. But this reasoning depends on his assumption that his deductions can influence reality. He believes that if he knows something must happen on a certain day, then the conditions of the judge's statement will be violated. But the surprise doesn't hinge on logic. It hinges on his state of mind at the moment of execution. And ironically, his belief that the hanging cannot happen makes him even more likely to be surprised when it does. Some philosophers argue that the problem lies in the self-referential nature of the statement. The judge's pronouncement refers to the prisoner's future knowledge about that very statement. It's a loop, a prediction about a reaction to a prediction. This is similar to other paradoxes that involve self-referential, like the liar paradox. This sentence is false. Just like the liar paradox collapses under its own structure, the unexpected hanging creates an epistemic instability. It folds in on itself when analyzed too deeply. Others have pointed out that the paradox may be a failure in the very idea of prediction. It shows us that the act of knowing can alter the thing we are trying to know. By trying to deduce the day of his death, the prisoner transforms the nature of the event itself. The surprise isn't nullified by logical deduction, it survives precisely because of it. His reasoning removes his expectation, and thus the surprise becomes possible again. Another way to approach this is through the lens of semantic ambiguity. What does surprise really mean in this context? Does it mean that he cannot possibly know the day in advance? Or does it mean that, at the moment, he does not expect it? These are different criteria. The former is impossibly strict. It would make any event logically predictable if analyzed far enough. The latter is softer. It focuses on the prisoner's psychological state. If we accept this second definition, the paradox begins to dissolve. The hanging is unexpected simply because the prisoner convinces himself it cannot happen, and thus it does, ironically fulfilling the original condition. This paradox isn't just an intellectual curiosity. It touches on how we experience uncertainty, how we prepare for the future, and how we cope with the unknown. In everyday life, we constantly make predictions, assumptions, and plans. We expect events to unfold in logical ways, but life has a way of catching us off guard, not in violation of logic, but in defiance of our assumptions. The unexpected hanging paradox reminds us that knowing too much can blind us to what's right in front of us. In legal theory, this paradox has been used to explore the boundaries of expectation and justice. Is it fair to execute someone who has convinced themselves they will not be executed? In epistemology, it challenges the nature of belief and knowledge. Is it possible to know the truth and still be surprised by it? In artificial intelligence and decision theory, it raises questions about how predictive systems handle recursive reasoning, systems that analyze their own predictions and make new ones based on that analysis. The unexpected hanging paradox forces us to reflect on the limits of logic, not because logic is broken, but because our experience of time, knowledge, and expectation is more complex than any one line of reasoning can capture. The prisoner's fate turns not on error, but on the interaction between knowledge and surprise, between thought and event. When we believe something cannot happen, we often stop preparing for it, and it is precisely in those moments of intellectual closure that the unexpected finds its way in. The prisoner's belief in his own invulnerability becomes his downfall, not because he miscalculated, but because he assumed that understanding the conditions of surprise could eliminate it. In doing so, he failed to realize that the very act of expecting a surprise negates it, and not expecting it restores it. Acceptation, perseverance. So the man is told he'll be hanged unexpectedly next week. He reasons his way into safety, and yet, one morning, the footsteps approach, the key rattles in the lock, the door creaks open, and in that instant the paradox is complete, not in theory, but in flesh. He is surprised, and in that surprise, all his logic, all his certainty, evaporates into the silence of an answer he could never quite predict. The liar paradox. This sentence is false. Is it true or false? At first glance, the sentence is brief, just 4 words long. This sentence is false. It seems simple enough, like a riddle or a child's play on words, but within that tiny sentence lies one of the deepest and most enduring problems in the history of logic and philosophy. The liar paradox has puzzled thinkers for thousands of years, from the ancient Greeks to modern logicians, and it continues to defy easy resolution. The moment you try to determine whether the sentence is true or false, you find yourself trapped in a loop, an infinite regression of contradictions that tears at the very structure of truth itself. Let's examine it closely. If the sentence, "This sentence is false," is true, then what it says must hold, so it must be false. But if it's false, then what it asserts isn't the case, which means it must be true. Either way, we circle back on ourselves. It cannot be simply true, and it cannot be simply false. It is both and neither at once. The sentence turns on itself, using its own truth to negate itself, and its falsehood to affirm itself. This self-referential contradiction is what gives the liar paradox its haunting power. The earliest recorded version of the liar paradox comes from the Greek philosopher Eubulides of Miletus, who lived in the 4th century BCE. He posed the paradox in the form of a single statement made by a man who says, "I am lying." If he is lying, then he is telling the truth about lying. But if he is telling the truth, then he must be lying. The statement collapses into contradiction. It does not merely contain false information, it destroys the very idea of truth and falsehood by entangling them in a closed loop. Over time, many variations of the paradox have emerged, but the essence remains the same, a sentence that refers to itself in a way that leads to inconsistency. What makes the liar paradox particularly unsettling is that it doesn't rely on obscure language or abstract mathematics. It uses everyday logic, ordinary words, and still renders our basic understanding of truth unstable. It's not a problem that exists in some remote corner of philosophy. It arises directly from how we use language and how we try to define what is real. Philosophers and logicians have tried to resolve the paradox in numerous ways. One approach is to argue that the sentence is simply meaningless, that it fails to make a proper claim and thus doesn't qualify as either true or false. According to this view, the problem disappears once we deny that the sentence has a truth value at all. But this solution comes at a cost. If we start calling such statements meaningless, we must also apply that label to many other self-referential statements that are useful and coherent, and, more importantly, The sentence seems perfectly well-formed and understandable. It looks like a meaningful sentence. It acts like one. So why should we deny it a truth value? Another approach is the idea of truth-value gaps, proposed by philosophers like Alfred Tarski. In this view, some sentences do not possess a truth value, neither true nor false. The liar sentence falls into this category. Tarski also suggested creating hierarchies of language, object language and meta-language, to avoid self-referential statements. In this model, a sentence about truth can only be made from a higher level language about the lower one. That way, a sentence cannot refer to its own truth value, and the paradox is prevented. However, such a hierarchical system limits our ability to speak naturally about truth. It forbids certain kinds of self-recognition, which are not only common in everyday language, but necessary in many branches of mathematics and logic. We use self-recognition all the time in the form of definitions, instructions, or feedback systems. Blocking it off entirely feels unnatural, as though we're redesigning language just to dodge a philosophical bullet. More recent approaches involve paraconsistent logic, which allows for contradictions to exist without collapsing the entire logical system. In this view, the liar sentence is both true and false at the same time, but the system does not explode into chaos because it is designed to tolerate such inconsistencies. This idea is radical. It challenges the foundational law of non-contradiction, which states that a proposition cannot be both true and false simultaneously. But in embracing contradiction, paraconsistent logic offers a way to live with the paradox rather than resolve it. Another compelling interpretation comes from the concept of semantic paradoxes and fixed-point theory, particularly in the work of Saul Kripke. Kripke proposed that we could treat sentences like, "This sentence is false," as belonging to a partially defined semantic space. In his framework, truth is not absolute, but rather builds up in layers. Some statements acquire truth values in early stages, while others remain undefined until later. The liar sentence never settles. It remains undefined across all layers. It's not false, it's not true, it just resists classification. But the most disturbing possibility is that the liar paradox isn't just a puzzle of language or logic. It may reflect something deeper about reality itself. Self-recognition is not confined to language. It exists in nature. It exists in consciousness. The mind can think about itself. Systems can modify themselves. We live in a self-awareness universe, and paradoxes like this may be more than quirks of syntax. They may be clues about the architecture of understanding itself. In computer science, for instance, self-representation shows up in recursion, feedback loops, and programming languages that can rewrite their own code. In biology, DNA replicates itself through mechanisms that refer back to their own structure. In art, M.C. Escher's drawings bend space in recursive patterns. In music, Bach's compositions contain self-reflective themes. Everywhere we look, the liar paradox finds echoes, not because it's broken, but because it reveals a profound symmetry between reflection and contradiction. And then there's the human mind. What are we doing when we say, "I am lying"? We are observing ourselves, commenting on ourselves, judging our own statements. The liar paradox is not just a sentence, it's a mirror. It reflects the nature of consciousness itself, the ability to turn inward and question what we are saying, what we are thinking, what we are. It is a glitch in logic, yes, but it is also a testament to the flexibility and fragility of self-awareness. So, is the sentence true or false? The answer may not be a choice between two poles. It may be that the question itself is flawed, or perhaps the sentence is a boundary marker, a point where our tools, language, logic, definition, fail to capture something fluid and dynamic. The liar paradox is not a problem to be solved, but a phenomenon to be witnessed. It challenges our desire for clean answers, for binary truths, for a world without ambiguity. Yet in embracing its ambiguity, we gain something greater. We see that language is not a perfect mirror of reality. We learn that truth is not always static, and we discover that even the simplest sentence can contain within it the full complexity of thought. This sentence is false. It is a loop, a puzzle, a paradox, but it is also an invitation to think more deeply, to ask better questions, and to accept that some truths do not lie on a straight line, but spiral inward, endlessly, into the center of what it means to know anything at all. The Monty Hall problem. You pick a door for a prize. Host reveals a goat behind another. Switch or stay. At first glance, it feels like a simple game show puzzle. You're standing before 3 closed doors. Behind one is a brand new car, shiny, sleek, the prize everyone wants. Behind the other 2 are goats, quirky, living consolation prizes that no one is exactly hoping for. The host, Monty Hall, asks you to pick one. You choose, say, door 1. Then Monty, who knows what lies behind every door, opens another, door 3, revealing a goat. He turns to you and asks, do you want to switch to door 2 or stick with your original choice? It's a moment charged with decision. Do you trust your gut and stay, or do you switch? Most people feel the odds are even now, 50-50. But shockingly, logic tells us otherwise. This is the Monty Hall problem, and the right answer isn't what most people expect. The correct choice is to switch, and the reasoning behind it is subtle but powerful. When you first pick a door, you have a 1 in 3 chance of choosing the car and a 2 in 3 chance of picking a goat. Those probabilities don't change after Monty opens a door. What changes is your information. If your initial choice was wrong, and statistically 2/3 of the time it is, then Monty's action has eliminated one of the wrong choices and funneled the better odds to the only remaining door you didn't pick. By switching, you now have a 2 in 3 chance of winning the car. Staying means you're still stuck with your original 1 in 3 chance. The odds tilt decisively in favor of switching. This result is so counterintuitive that even mathematicians and scientists have argued over it. When Marilyn Vos Savant, known for having one of the highest recorded IQs, published the correct explanation in her column in Parade magazine in 1990, thousands of readers, including many PhDs, wrote in to insist she was wrong. But she wasn't. The math holds up, and the deeper you explore it, the more it reveals about probability, perception, and the often surprising nature of rational choice. Let's walk through the logic again. Initially, you pick one door. There's a 1 in 3 chance the car is behind that door, and a 2 in 3 chance it's behind one of the other 2. Then Monty opens one of those 2 remaining doors and shows you a goat. He always shows a goat, never the car, because he knows where the car is and deliberately avoids it. This is key. His action is not random, it's informed, and because of that, it contains hidden information. If your original choice was correct, meaning you picked the car, you're fine sticking with it, but that only happens 1 out of 3 times. The other 2 out of 3 times, you initially picked a goat. In those cases, Monty is removing the other goat, leaving the car behind the remaining unchosen door. So by switching, you essentially bet that your first pick was wrong, which it probably was. The odds favor switching because Monty's action filters the possibilities. To truly grasp this, consider an exaggerated version of the problem. Imagine 100 doors instead of 3. 1 car, 99 goats. You pick door 1. The odds that you chose the car are now 1 in 100. The odds that it's behind one of the 99 other doors is 99 in 100. Now, Monty, still knowing what's behind every door, opens 98 other doors, all revealing goats. Only your chosen door and 1 other remain closed. Would you switch? Suddenly, it becomes much clearer that you should. There's only a 1% chance you got it right the first time, and a 99% chance you didn't. Monty has essentially funneled all that probability into the 1 remaining door you didn't choose. That's where the car almost certainly is. The Monty Hall problem demonstrates something fundamental about probability. It doesn't always behave in line with our intuitions. We like to think in binaries, this or that, 50-50, yes or no. But probability, especially when it involves conditional information, follows rules that twist our expectations. Monty's role is critical. If he opened a door at random without knowing what was behind it, the math would change. But because his choice is guided, he always shows you a goat. It reshapes the problem. His action gives you information, and that information affects your odds. This paradox isn't just a curiosity. It has practical implications in statistics, game theory, and decision-making. It reminds us that new information can and should change our thinking. When new data comes in, sticking to your original assumption may not be the rational move. In life, as in the Monty Hall game, it often pays to reevaluate, update your understanding, and make the switch. But there's a psychological layer too. Many people refuse to switch because they feel a sense of ownership over their initial choice. They fear regret more intensely if they switch and lose compared to if they stay and lose. This is known as loss aversion, a cognitive bias where the pain of losing outweighs the joy of winning. Emotionally, it's safer to stay. Rationally, it's smarter to switch. The Monty Hall problem also illustrates a key principle of Bayesian reasoning, a method of statistical inference that updates the probability for a hypothesis as more evidence becomes available. When Monty opens a door and shows a goat, he provides new evidence. Bayesian reasoning tells us to revise our probabilities in light of that evidence. And when we do, the advantage of switching becomes clear. There's beauty in how such a simple game reveals so much about the human mind and the structure of chance. It teaches humility. Our gut instincts aren't always right. It teaches adaptability. New information changes the game. And it teaches clarity. What seems fair and balanced on the surface may be lopsided underneath. Some skeptics still resist the conclusion. They argue, but Monty opened a door, one goat is gone, now it's just between two doors, how can it not be 50-50? The answer lies in remembering that Monty's action isn't neutral. He didn't just remove a goat, he removed a goat with full knowledge of where the car is. That intentionality is what makes the difference. If you simulate the game thousands of times, switching every time, you'll find you win roughly 66% of the time. Stick every time, and you win only about 33%. The numbers don't lie. And yet, the problem continues to confound people. It's often used in classrooms, interviews, and puzzles, precisely because of its deceptive simplicity. It takes something familiar, a choice, a chance, and turns it upside down. It forces us to slow down, to think more deeply about assumptions, and to embrace the strange but undeniable power of probability. In a world that often values certainty, the Monty Hall problem reminds us that understanding uncertainty is a kind of superpower. It shows us how to think beyond the obvious, how to let go of instinct when reason points another way, and how to embrace complexity rather than shy away from it. The game show may be imaginary, but the lesson is very real. So next time you're offered a choice, 3 doors, 1 prize, a twist of fate, remember what Monty Hall taught us. The odds may not be what they seem. The safe choice may not be the smart one. And sometimes, when life opens a door and shows you a goat, it's the universe's way of telling you, switch. Because behind another door, quietly waiting, might just be the car. The Ship of Theseus. If you replace every part of a ship, is it still the same ship? Imagine an ancient ship, the proud vessel of a legendary hero, Theseus. This ship is carefully preserved in a museum, a symbol of history, honor, and identity. Over time, however, some of the ship's wooden planks begin to rot. One by one, they are replaced with fresh wood. First the hull, then the deck, then the mast. Eventually, every single piece of the original ship has been substituted. Not a single plank, nail, or fiber remains from the original structure, and yet, it still looks like the Ship of Theseus. It occupies the same space in the museum, holds the same name, and bears the same story. But, is it still the same ship? This is the famous philosophical thought experiment known as the Ship of Theseus. It is a paradox that invites us to explore the nature of identity, persistence, and change. The puzzle is deceptively simple in form, yet endlessly complex in implication. At its heart lies a question: what makes something what it is? Is it the material from which it is made, the continuity of form, the function it serves, or the history it carries? Let's examine the first layer of the problem. If identity is tied to material composition, then replacing every part would mean the object is no longer the same. By this logic, the Ship of Theseus, after full replacement, is not the original ship at all, it is a replica. Like a statue reconstructed from new marble or a painting copied with fresh pigment, the physical matter has changed, and with it, perhaps, the object's identity. But many argue that identity is not so rigid. In everyday life, we accept that objects and people change continuously while retaining their identity. A person's cells regenerate over time, bones remodel, hair grows and falls, yet we do not cease to be ourselves. Our identity persists despite constant biological change. So why can't the same be true for a ship? If the replacements are gradual, careful, and respectful of the original structure, perhaps continuity, not composition, is what defines identity. Now consider a twist. Suppose someone had collected all the discarded parts from the original Ship of Theseus and, over time, reassembled them into a full ship. Now we have two vessels, one composed entirely of new parts but in the same configuration, and one composed of the original materials but reconstructed elsewhere. Which is the true Ship of Theseus? This variation of the paradox deepens the dilemma. If you say the newly constructed ship made from original parts is the real one, then you're asserting that identity lies in material continuity. But if you say the ship that remained in its original place, maintained its function, and evolved gradually is the real one, then you're choosing continuity of structure and function over substance. Either answer has implications that ripple outward, challenging how we think about memory, existence, and selfhood. Philosophers have approached this paradox from multiple angles. Some, like Heraclitus, might say identity is an illusion. After all, no man ever steps in the same river twice. Everything is in flux, and permanence is a mental construct we use to navigate a changing world. In this view, the Ship of Theseus was never truly the same from one moment to the next. Its identity was a story we told ourselves, a convenient fiction layered over the reality of impermanence. Others take a more essentialist approach, arguing that identity must be rooted in something unchanging, perhaps a soul, a pattern, or a purpose. For the ship, its design, function, or symbolic role might constitute its essence. Even if every part is replaced, it remains Theseus's ship because it plays the role Theseus's ship was meant to play. It carries forward the idea of the original, like a flame passed from candle to candle. This idea aligns with modern concepts of functional identity found in fields like computer science and cognitive psychology. Consider a software program transferred from one computer to another. The hardware changes, but the program remains the same because its function and structure persist. Similarly, a book reprinted in millions of copies retains its identity across different pages and binding. The identity lies in the information, not the substrate. Yet there is a danger in reducing identity to abstract patterns. It detaches us from the material reality that shapes and grounds our experiences. The Ship of Theseus wasn't just a collection of boards and nails, it was a vessel that sailed real seas, endured real storms, and bore real people. To say its identity survives replacement is comforting, but it risks overlooking the weight of history embedded in material form. The paradox also raises profound questions about personal identity. If we, like the ship, are constantly changing, what makes us the same person over time? Is it memory, consciousness, the continuity of experience, or something deeper, more elusive? If a person were gradually replaced by artificial parts, first limbs, then organs, then brain tissue, at what point, if any, would they cease to be themselves? The Ship of Theseus becomes a metaphor for the human condition, for aging, transformation, and survival. Even legal systems grapple with these questions. If a company replaces every employee, changes its location, and rebuilds its brand from scratch, is it still the same company? In the digital world, where identities can be cloned, edited, or erased, what makes an online presence real? The paradox isn't just philosophical, it's practical. It touches everything from heritage preservation to artificial intelligence. One way to navigate the Ship of Theseus problem is to recognize that identity may be multidimensional. It might not reside in a single aspect, material, function, history, but in the dynamic interplay of all of them. In this view, identity is not a binary of same or different, but a spectrum. The ship can be mostly the same, partially the same, or symbolically the same, depending on the criteria used. In fact, language itself may be part of the problem. Our desire to name and categorize leads us to seek a single, definitive answer. But identity might not be that kind of thing. It may be fluid, contextual, and relational. The Ship of Theseus is a ship and not a ship, a continuity and a break, a relic and a renewal, all at once. And perhaps that's the deeper lesson. Identity, whether of ships, people, or ideas, is not static. It's a process, a story told over time, shaped by memory, meaning, and context. The Ship of Theseus invites us to look beyond surfaces, to embrace complexity, and to accept that some questions are better lived than solved. So, is it still the same ship? That depends. If identity is memory, then yes. If identity is matter, then no. If identity is function, perhaps. If identity is meaning, absolutely. And if identity is all of these and more, then the question itself may be too narrow for the richness of what the ship and we really are. The Ship of Theseus sails not just through the sea, but through our minds. It drifts between logic and emotion, between what we know and what we feel, between the need for certainty and the beauty of ambiguity. And, whether its boards are old or new, whether its mast is original or rebuilt, it continues to carry us through time, through change, and through the paradoxes that shape us all. The paradox of the ravens. Seeing a green apple can support the claim that all ravens are black. At first glance, this statement seems absurd. How could observing a green apple tell us anything meaningful about ravens, let alone support the universal claim that all ravens are black? Yet this is exactly the counterintuitive heart of Hempel's paradox, also known as the paradox of the ravens. Introduced by the German logician Carl Gustav Hempel in the 1940s, this thought experiment challenges our assumptions about logic, evidence, and the nature of scientific reasoning. What begins as a simple test of how we confirm universal statements soon turns into a profound puzzle about how we interpret knowledge itself. Let's start with the basic logical structure of the problem. Suppose we make the statement, all ravens are black. This is a universal claim. It asserts that every object in the category of raven has the property blackness. Now, according to the principles of logic, this statement is equivalent to its contrapositive. All non-brick things are not ravens. This logical equivalence means that both statements must always be true or false together. If one is true, so is the other. If one is false, so is the other. Now here's where the paradox creeps in. If seeing a black raven supports the hypothesis that all ravens are black, which intuitively makes sense, then by logical equivalence, observing a non-black non-raven, such as a green apple, should also support the contrapositive. All non-black things are not ravens. Since that contrapositive is logically equivalent to our original statement, it follows that seeing a green apple provides confirmation that all ravens are black. This seems completely wrong. A green apple has nothing to do with ravens. It's not a bird, not black, not part of the same domain. Yet, Under strict formal logic, it counts as supporting evidence. This is the paradox. How can something so obviously irrelevant contribute, however slightly, to the confirmation of a sweeping scientific claim? To untangle this, we need to examine what it means to confirm a universal generalization. In everyday reasoning, we intuitively think that to support the statement, "all ravens are black," we should look at ravens. We gather more examples of ravens and check if they're black. Each additional black raven we observe adds weight to the hypothesis. This is inductive reasoning in its classic form, moving from specific observations to general rules. But logic operates under a different principle. In propositional logic, a statement and its contrapositive are treated identically, so anything that confirms the contrapositive should confirm the original statement. If we accept that, then we must accept that a green apple, being a non-bark, non-raven, offers confirmation, however tiny, to the hypothesis. This dissonance between formal logic and intuitive reasoning is the true engine of Hempel's paradox. It reveals a gap between how we think evidence should work and how it actually behaves under logical analysis. The paradox doesn't arise because logic is faulty, but because our expectations about relevance and confirmation don't always align with the rules of formal inference. One way to approach this paradox is through the idea of confirmation theory, the branch of philosophy and logic that studies how evidence supports or undermines hypotheses. Hempel originally formulated the paradox as part of his broader exploration of how scientific claims are confirmed. In his system, any instance of a statement's contrapositive contributes to its confirmation. But even Hempel recognized the troubling implications of this result. Critics of this view argue that while logical equivalence holds in theory, not all observations are equally useful in practice. Observing a black raven gives us relevant information about the subject of the hypothesis. Observing a green apple doesn't. It's true that the apple doesn't falsify the statement, it's consistent with it, but consistency isn't the same as meaningful confirmation. The key issue here is relevance. Just because something is logically consistent with a hypothesis doesn't mean it tells us anything substantial about it. To address this, philosophers like Clark Glymour and others introduce the concept of Bayesian confirmation theory. In this framework, confirmation is understood in terms of probability. Instead of asking whether an observation logically confirms a hypothesis, we ask whether it raises the probability that the hypothesis is true. In this view, observing a green apple might technically increase the probability that all ravens are black, but only by an infinitesimally small amount. The universe is filled with non-back non-ravens. Seeing one more doesn't move the needle much. On the other hand, observing a black raven significantly strengthens the hypothesis because it directly addresses the core claim. This probabilistic perspective helps explain why the paradox feels so strange. It's not that a green apple offers no confirmation. It's that its confirmation is so weak and diluted by the vast number of irrelevant cases that it feels meaningless. In contrast, each black raven you observe is a much stronger and more focused piece of evidence. Bayesian reasoning reintroduces the notion of weight of evidence, which pure logic often ignores. Another dimension to the paradox involves the paradox of triviality. If we accept that observing any non-back non-raven supports the statement "all ravens are black," then everyday life becomes a bizarre exercise in irrelevant confirmation. Every time you look at a red chair, a white cloud, or a blue car, you are supposedly gathering more evidence that ravens are black. This trivialization of evidence undermines the whole idea of scientific inquiry. It suggests that we can confirm hypotheses without ever observing their actual subjects. This is where intuition reasserts itself. Most of us reject the idea that such observations are helpful. Science, after all, is not just about collecting logically consistent data. It's about testing claims in targeted, empirical ways. Hempel's paradox doesn't break logic, but it exposes its limitations in modeling how real-world knowledge works. We don't just want confirmation, we want meaningful confirmation. We want relevance, specificity, and explanatory power. Still, the paradox remains valuable because it forces us to question how we treat evidence. It reminds us that confirmation isn't as straightforward as it seems. It invites us to refine our understanding of inference, to distinguish between logical possibility and epistemic utility. In doing so, it deepens our grasp of how science progresses, not just through observation, but through thoughtful interpretation of what those observations mean. And there's a poetic quality to the paradox too. In suggesting that a green apple might confirm something about ravens, it invites us to see the universe as interconnected in strange and subtle ways. It challenges our assumptions about separateness and relevance. It asks us to consider whether every observation, no matter how mundane, participates, however faintly, in the grand web of truth. So, does seeing a green apple confirm that all ravens are black? Formally, yes, just barely. Practically, hardly at all. Meaningfully, probably not. But in contemplating that tension, we gain insight not only into the nature of logic, but into the art of thinking itself. For in every paradox lies a challenge, not to deny logic, but to look deeper into how we apply it, how we interpret it, and how we learn from the unexpected places it leads us. The two-envelope paradox. You choose one of two envelopes with money. Should you switch, knowing the other might have more? You are presented with a simple choice. Two identical envelopes lie before you, and you are told that one of them contains exactly twice as much money as the other. You don't know how much money is inside either envelope, but you are allowed to choose one. After selecting your envelope, but before opening it, you are offered a chance to switch to the other. Now the question arises, should you switch? Intuitively, it may seem like it makes no difference. After all, the envelopes are indistinguishable, and without any further information, it seems like a coin toss. Yet, when you start to analyze the situation mathematically, something strange emerges. Suppose the envelope you selected contains an amount of money, which we'll call X. That means the other envelope either contains 2x or x2, depending on whether you initially picked the smaller or the larger amount. If you think in terms of expected value, the average amount you would expect to receive if you repeated the process many times, you calculate the following. There is a 50% chance the other envelope contains 2x, and a 50% chance it contains x2. The expected value becomes 0.5 times 2x plus 0.5 times x divided by 2 equals x, plus x divided by 4, which equals 1.25x. This seems to suggest that the other envelope is worth more than the one you picked, so you switch. But then the same logic applies again. If you now think of the new envelope as holding y, the same calculation will suggest you should switch back. And again, and again. Each envelope seems to be better than the other, depending on which one you're holding. This is the paradox. The logic implies that no matter which envelope you choose, you should always switch, leading to an infinite loop of indecision. The two-envelope paradox is one of those elegant puzzles that slips easily into your mind, but proves incredibly difficult to escape. It's not just a math problem. It's a philosophical and logical puzzle that cuts into the nature of expectation, probability, and rational decision-making. How can both envelopes always be better than the other? What's wrong with the reasoning? To find clarity, we have to look at where the paradox emerges. The expected value calculation appears correct on the surface, but it hides a flaw beneath its simplicity. The problem lies in the assumption that you can use the value x from your chosen envelope to model the expected value of the other. But x itself is a variable, and using it without specifying whether it's the smaller or the larger amount leads to a subtle misuse of probability. Let's suppose you picked the envelope containing the smaller amount, which we'll call A, then the other envelope contains 2A. If you instead pick the larger amount, 2A, then the other envelope has A. In either case, one envelope has A and the other has 2A, but now if we open the envelope and see, say, $100, 0 cents, What can we conclude? Is $100 0 cents the smaller amount A or the larger 2A? Without a defined probability distribution over the amounts, we cannot meaningfully assign equal likelihood to each case. That's the first crack in the logic. When you attempt to assign probabilities to whether the envelope you picked is the smaller or the larger amount, you assume a uniform probability across all positive monetary values. But such a distribution doesn't exist. There's no uniform distribution over the positive real numbers that yields equal probability for every possible dollar amount. That's part of the reason why the expected value calculation leads to paradox. It relies on an impossible assumption about how the money is distributed. One proposed resolution to the paradox involves introducing a proper probability distribution over the possible amounts of money. Suppose the money amounts are selected using a distribution with a defined mean, say, exponentially decreasing probabilities for higher amounts. In that case, the expected value calculation becomes grounded in that distribution, and the paradox disappears. Under those conditions, switching does not always improve your expected outcome. It depends on what amount you see. Another way to understand the flaw is through conditional probability. If you peek inside your envelope and find $100 0 cents, now you have actual information to work with. The probability that $100 0 cents is the smaller amount depends on how likely the experiment was to produce $100 0 cents as the smaller versus as the larger amount. With a defined distribution, you can update your beliefs accordingly using Bayes' theorem. Sometimes it may be rational to switch, other times not. The point is, context matters, and assumptions must be clearly stated. Interestingly, the paradox persists even when you don't open the envelope. The mere act of calculating expected values based on an unknown variable can be misleading if the context and assumptions are not well structured. The paradox teaches us something profound. Mathematical expectation is only meaningful when tied to a well-defined probability space. Without that foundation, the numbers become unmoored from meaning, and the logic begins to loop irrationally. There's also a philosophical layer to this problem. It challenges the very idea of rational choice under uncertainty. It shows how seductive but flawed reasoning can lead even a perfectly logical person into an infinite regress of better options. In real life, we often face choices between seemingly equal alternatives. The paradox reminds us that obsessing over hypothetical advantages, especially when based on flawed assumptions, can paralyze decision-making. It's a cautionary tale against overthinking. And there's a psychological dimension too. The paradox exploits our cognitive bias toward regret minimization. We imagine switching and winning, or staying and losing, and both thoughts pressure us into second-guessing our decision. The infinite switch loop represents the fear that there's always a better choice just out of reach. This kind of thinking isn't unique to envelope games. It plays out in relationships, careers, investments, and daily life. The mind craves certainty, but the world often denies it. The two-envelope paradox symbolizes that tension. Another way to ground the problem is by considering a concrete example. Suppose someone tells you that one envelope contains $50 0 cents, and the other contains either $25 0 cents or $100 0 cents. Now, if you pick and get $50 0 cents, should you switch? Well, it depends on how those amounts were selected. If the amounts were generated using a consistent doubling or halving rule, and you know that $50 0 cents is in the middle of that pair, then you might use that information to calculate expected values and make a reasoned choice. But this depends on a known mechanism. Without it, switching becomes a leap in the dark. In real-world decision-making, information is never perfect, and assumptions matter. The paradox arises when we attempt to assign meaningful probabilities to scenarios that lack a clearly defined framework. The trap is subtle because it dresses itself in the language of rigorous mathematics, but logic, like any tool, requires proper handling. Otherwise, it can cut in the wrong direction. The two-envelope paradox doesn't tell us that math is broken. It tells us that our reasoning must be careful, especially in the presence of uncertainty. It teaches us that expected value, while a powerful concept, is not infallible when built on shaky ground. And it reminds us that behind every equation lies a story about assumptions, about perspective, and about the strange dance between knowledge and ignorance. So, should you switch? If you have no idea how the amounts were chosen and you haven't opened your envelope, then there's no reason to prefer one over the other. But if you do open it, and if you have a reasonable model for how the values were assigned, then your decision can be more informed. But even then, beware the infinite loop of doubt, for the two-envelope paradox is less about envelopes and more about the human desire for certainty in a world built on chance. The Teletransportation Paradox. If you're disassembled atom by atom and rebuilt elsewhere, is that still you? Imagine a future where teleportation is not just science fiction, but science fact. You step into a sleek machine, say goodbye to your friends, and press a button. Instantly, your body is disassembled, atom by atom, cell by cell, down to the very last molecule. That detailed atomic blueprint is transmitted across space to another location, where it is used to reconstruct you perfectly. Molecule for molecule, thought for thought. The new you wakes up in a different place, apparently the same in every way. Same memories, same personality, same appearance. But here comes the haunting question at the core of the Teletransportation Paradox. Is the person who emerges from the receiving chamber really you, or is it just a convincing copy? At first glance, it might seem obvious. If the replica behaves like you, thinks like you, remembers what you remember, and insists that it is you, why not consider it you? After all, from a functional standpoint, nothing is missing. The old you is gone, and the new you carries on as if nothing happened. But as you dig deeper, a disturbing tension arises. Something doesn't quite feel right. What if, instead of being destroyed in the process, your original body remained in? Now there are two of you, each claiming to be the same person. Which one is the real you? Or are both equally valid? This is the crux of the Teletransportation Paradox. It's a thought experiment that explores the boundaries of personal identity, consciousness, and the self. Made famous by philosophers such as Derek Parfit, it doesn't just raise questions about futuristic technology, it forces us to examine what it really means to be you. Is your identity tied to your physical body, to your memories, to the continuity of your consciousness, or is it something more elusive? Consider first the argument from material continuity. You are made of a specific collection of atoms. If your body is destroyed and rebuilt from different atoms, even if arranged exactly the same, then materially speaking, you are not the same. You're a replica. The original has ceased to exist. This view insists that identity cannot survive the destruction of the body, even if the replacement is perfect. From this perspective, the teleportation chamber is not a travel device, it's a high-tech execution followed by cloning. But others argue that material substance doesn't define identity, structure does. Your atoms are not unique, they're replaced constantly as you breathe, eat, and age. Your body is in flux. What remains stable is the pattern, the information, the organization, the relationships between parts. If the teleporter preserves this pattern, then identity is preserved. This view aligns with functionalism in the philosophy of mind. You are the software, not the hardware. As long as the program runs the same, the machine can be swapped out. Still, this doesn't resolve everything. Imagine two identical copies are made, one on Mars, one on the Moon. Both claim to be you. Both have your memories, your traits, your quirks. Yet they now exist as separate beings. They will accumulate different experiences from this moment forward. They will begin to diverge. So were they ever really the same person? Or does the very act of duplication shatter the illusion of singular identity? This leads us to the idea of psychological continuity. Some philosophers argue that personal identity consists in the continuity of memory and consciousness. If the new being remembers your life and experiences the world through your perspective, then it is you. But this view has its own complications. Suppose someone copies your memories into another brain without destroying your original body. Now both the original and the copy have psychological continuity with you. Does that mean you now exist in two places at once? Or does identity split, like a branching river? Derek Parfit famously argued that questions like these show that identity may not be what we think it is. He suggested that personal identity is not what matters most. What really matters, he claimed, is psychological connectedness and continuity. If teleportation preserves those, then the survival of you is not tied to whether the outcome is the same person, but whether it carries on the thoughts, desires, and goals that make up your mental life. From this angle, the copy is not a different person, it's a future version of you. The fact that the original was destroyed is tragic perhaps but irrelevant to the survival of what truly matters. Yet this philosophical comfort doesn't always satisfy our emotional intuition. Imagine standing before the teleportation machine, knowing that the process involves complete disintegration. Do you feel reassured that a perfect copy will step out on the other side? Or do you feel dread, as if facing your own annihilation? Our gut tells us that continuity of experience is vital. We don't just want someone else to wake up with our memories, we want to be the one who wakes up. If the teleportation process breaks the stream of consciousness, even briefly, does it matter how good the reconstruction is? This brings us to a crucial aspect of the paradox: subjective continuity, the sense of being a continuous I from moment to moment. It's a fragile thread, not easily captured by physical or psychological criteria. It is possible that the person who steps out of the teleportation machine will behave exactly like you, think exactly like you, and insist they are you. But your current stream of consciousness may still have ended when the disintegration began. From your perspective, you never make it to the other side. You are gone. The one who continues is someone else, though they may never realize it. This is where the paradox gets personal. It forces us to ask what we really care about in survival. Do we care about someone carrying on our legacy, our relationships, our goals? Or do we care about the persistence of this conscious moment, this inner experience of being? And if we cannot preserve that inner continuity, does anything else matter? There's also the moral dimension to consider. If teleportation destroys the original and replaces them with a copy, is it ethical? Would you volunteer to be teleported, knowing you might not survive in the deepest sense? If society adopted teleportation as a standard form of travel, would we be normalizing a kind of daily suicide? Or would we gradually change our concept of self to accommodate a new understanding of continuity? Science fiction has long explored these themes. From Star Trek to Black Mirror, teleportation and cloning are often used as metaphors for identity, mortality, and the fragility of the self. They dramatize the gap between our logical and emotional understandings. Logic may say the copy is you, but the heart whispers that something was lost in translation. The Teletransportation Paradox doesn't offer a clear solution. That's its power. It destabilizes our assumptions and leaves us with questions more profound than answers. What are we? Where does identity reside? Is there a core self, or just a pattern that evolves and replicates? Is death the end of consciousness, or can consciousness be copied and restarted? And most haunting of all, if you step into the teleporter, who is it that steps out? These are not just speculative questions. As technology advances, through brain-computer interfaces, artificial intelligence, and digital memory preservation, the boundaries between original and copy, between body and mind, between destruction and continuity may begin to blur. The Teletransportation Paradox, then, is not just a puzzle of future fiction, it is a mirror held up to the self, inviting us to ask what truly endures when everything else is replaced. Russell's Paradox. Does the set of all sets that do not contain themselves contain itself? Imagine a shelf filled with books, some of which are about other books, and some that are about themselves. Now, suppose you try to make a special list, a list of all books that do not list themselves. You look over the shelf and include every book that doesn't mention itself in its own pages. Then you ask a curious question: should that very list, the one you're making, include itself? If it does include itself, then by definition it shouldn't, and if it doesn't, then according to its own criteria, it must. This strange loop is the heart of Russell's paradox, a discovery that shook the foundations of mathematics and logic in the early 20th century. Formulated by the British philosopher and logician Bertrand Russell in 1901, the paradox centers around the idea of sets, collections of objects. In ordinary life, we form sets all the time. The set of red apples, the set of prime numbers, the set of books on a shelf. Sets can contain all sorts of things, including other sets. Some sets, like the set of all cats, don't contain themselves, but others can, such as the set of all sets, which by definition would include itself. Russell's insight was deceptively simple. Suppose we define a set, let's call it R, as the set of all sets that do not contain themselves as a member. Now the question arises, does R contain itself? If it does, then it must not, because R only contains sets that do not contain themselves. But if it doesn't contain itself, then it meets the condition for inclusion, so it must contain itself. Either way, a contradiction is born. This paradox is not just a quirky brain teaser. It revealed a deep inconsistency in naive set theory, which at the time was considered the solid groundwork of all mathematics. Mathematicians like Georg Cantor had been working with sets to build the architecture of number theory, functions, and even geometry. The idea was that everything in mathematics could be constructed from sets. But Russell's paradox showed that this foundation was cracked. If a set could be defined in terms of any descriptive property, as naive set theory assumed, then contradictions like Russell's were unavoidable. Let's look more closely at what makes the paradox tick. The contradiction stems from self-perception, the idea that an entity refers to or contains itself. This is the same logical pitfall that lies at the heart of the liar paradox. This sentence is false. If the sentence is true, then it must be false. If it's false, then it must be true. Russell's paradox brings this kind of looping contradiction into the world of mathematics, where precision and consistency are supposed to reign supreme. To see why this is such a problem, consider the goal of formal mathematics: to define mathematical objects in rigorous ways, using logic and clear rules. But if the rules allow for paradoxical definitions, the whole system risks collapse. Imagine trying to build an entire mathematical structure, proofs, theorems, operations, on a foundation that contains logical contradiction. Any inconsistency in logic can, in principle, allow for any statement to be both true and false, making the entire system meaningless. Russell's paradox forced mathematicians and philosophers to rethink the fundamentals. One of the first major responses came from the German mathematician Ernst Zermelo, who proposed a more restricted version of set theory, later refined into Zermelo-Fraenkel's set theory. This system avoids the paradox by placing strict rules on how sets can be formed. In ZF, you can't just define a set by any arbitrary condition. Instead, sets can only be built from other sets in specific, controlled ways. Under these constraints, the problematic set R cannot be formed, and the paradox is sidestepped. Another important response came from Russell himself, who developed type theory. In this framework, sets and elements are organized into a hierarchy of types. A set of type N can only contain elements of a lower type, such as type N1. This means a set cannot contain itself, because it would require it to be both a higher and lower type simultaneously, something the rules prohibit. Type theory helped clarify logical language and influenced the development of computer science and formal logic, although it was considered cumbersome for general mathematical use. Still, the implications of the paradox go beyond technical fixes. They invite us to question our assumptions about abstraction, definition, and self-representation. We often think we can define anything we like just by describing it clearly. But Russell's paradox shows that not all descriptions are logically coherent, especially when they refer to themselves. It forces a distinction between what is linguistically expressible and what is logically permissible. The paradox also illustrates a broader theme in logic, that systems powerful enough to describe themselves often contain the seeds of their own contradiction. This theme reemerges in Gödel's incompleteness theorems, which showed that in any consistent mathematical system, rich enough to include arithmetic, there are true statements that cannot be proven within the system itself. Gödel's work, like Russell's, used self-referencing in a profound way, revealing the inherent limits of formal science. Beyond mathematics and logic, Russell's paradox resonates with ideas in philosophy, computer science, and even linguistics. In programming, self-referential structures can cause infinite loops or crashes if not handled carefully. In language, self-referential statements can lead to ambiguity or contradiction. In metaphysics, the question of whether the universe contains itself, or whether thought can fully grasp itself, echoes the same recursive tension. The paradox also invites reflection on the concept of identity. What does it mean for a set to contain itself? Can a thing truly be part of itself? Or does membership always imply a kind of separation between container and contained? These questions are not merely academic. They touch on how we think about categories, hierarchies, and the nature of existence. In a way, Russell's paradox is a mirror. It reflects the strengths and limits of human reason. It shows how our capacity for abstraction allows us to create powerful ideas, but also how that very power can lead us into contradiction if not carefully guided. It is a humbling reminder that logic, while immensely powerful, must be wielded with precision. So, does the set of all sets that do not contain themselves contain itself? The answer is not yes or no, but rather the question itself breaks the rules. It tries to create a category so broadly defined that it folds in on itself, creating a logical knot that cannot be untangled within naive set theory. The only resolution is to change the rules, to limit what kinds of sets we allow, or to refine our language to prevent such self-destructive definitions. Russell's paradox marks a turning point in the philosophy of mathematics. It helped launch the field of mathematical logic and ushered in a more rigorous approach to foundational questions. It showed that even the most basic concepts, like the idea of a set, require careful scrutiny. And it left us with a legacy, a recognition that within our greatest intellectual tools lie puzzles that reflect both our genius and our fallibility. The paradox doesn't tell us that logic fails. It tells us that logic is delicate. It invites us to move forward, not by discarding abstraction, but by understanding its boundaries. For in those boundaries lies the path to clearer thought, deeper knowledge, and a more profound understanding of the strange and beautiful structures that define both mathematics and the human mind. The paradox of tolerance. Should a tolerant society tolerate intolerance? Tolerance is often seen as one of the highest virtues of a free and open society. It represents the willingness to allow differing opinions, beliefs, and ways of life to coexist peacefully. A tolerant society welcomes diversity, values freedom of expression, and resists the urge to silence those who think or live differently. But this noble ideal raises a troubling question. What happens when tolerance is extended to those who are themselves intolerant? Should a tolerant society tolerate the very ideas and actions that seek to undermine or destroy it? This is the paradox of tolerance, first articulated by philosopher Karl Popper in 1945, and it remains one of the most pressing moral and political dilemmas of our time. Popper formulated the paradox in response to the rise of fascism and authoritarianism during the early 20th century. In his influential work, The Open Society and Its Enemies, he warned that unlimited tolerance could lead to the end of tolerance itself. If a society is tolerant without limit, then it risks being destroyed by the intolerant. Those who preach hate, violence, or exclusion can, if left unchecked, exploit the very freedoms of a tolerant society to spread their ideology and eventually suppress tolerance altogether. In such a scenario, the tolerant would be defeated by their own principles. The logic is chillingly clear. Imagine a democratic nation that allows every voice to be heard, including those that call for the dismantling of democracy. If fascists are allowed to organize freely, incite hatred, and advocate for a totalitarian state, then the tools of democracy are used to destroy democracy. Once in power, the intolerant have no obligation to maintain the freedoms that help them ascend. History offers brutal examples of this progression, where tolerance enabled the rise of those who had no intention of preserving it. So, should a tolerant society draw the line? And if so, where? Popper's answer was that we should not tolerate the intolerant when their words and actions threaten the fabric of an open society. In other words, intolerance should not be tolerated when it becomes active, militant, or seeks to silence others. He argued that it is not only reasonable but necessary to defend tolerance with force if needed. Otherwise, the open society collapses under the weight of its own idealism. This stance may seem contradictory at first. After all, isn't suppressing speech inherently intolerant? Doesn't that make the tolerant society guilty of the very thing it condemns? This is where the paradox tightens its grip, because defending tolerance may require being intolerant of certain forms of speech and behavior. The line between protection and suppression becomes blurred, and the very act of exclusion can resemble the intolerance it seeks to eliminate. To navigate this, we must refine our understanding of tolerance. True tolerance is not moral relativism. It does not mean accepting all views as equally valid, nor does it require the approval of harmful ideologies. Rather, it is a commitment to the peaceful coexistence of differing perspectives within a framework of shared values, such as human rights, nonviolence, equality, and dignity. When a belief or movement openly rejects those values, it places itself outside the bounds of what tolerance is meant to protect. In this light, tolerating intolerance is not an act of virtue, it is an act of negligence. It allows those who reject the social contract to exploit it, putting the most vulnerable members of society at risk. Tolerating racism, misogyny, xenophobia, or authoritarianism in the name of free speech is not a sign of strength. It is a failure to defend the core principles that make tolerance meaningful. However, this still leaves us with the practical question: how do we distinguish between dissent and dangerous intolerance? Not every controversial opinion is a threat. A healthy democracy depends on debate, disagreement, and even discomfort. The goal is not to silence every offensive or unpopular view, but to identify when a belief crosses the line into incitement, dehumanization, or violence. Free speech is not absolute. It has always been balanced against public safety, truth, and justice. Consider the example of hate speech. While definitions vary by country and legal tradition, hate speech typically refers to speech that incites violence or discrimination against individuals or groups based on race, religion, gender, or other identity markers. When such speech gains traction, it can create a climate of fear, exclusion, and harm. In this case, restricting it is not an act of censorship, it is an act of defense. It is the immune system of a tolerant society protecting itself from ideological infection. But what about peaceful but intolerant ideologies? For example, what if a group advocates for laws that would restrict the rights of others, but does so through democratic means? Should that group be tolerated until it gains enough power to act? This is perhaps the most difficult edge of the paradox. Here, the danger lies not in violence, but in gradual erosion. A society might allow intolerance to flourish under the radar, disguising itself in polite discourse, respectable institutions, or appeals to tradition. By the time it reveals its true face, the damage may already be done. This is why vigilance matters. A tolerant society must cultivate not only laws, but also cultural norms that reject bigotry and uphold inclusion. Education, public discourse, and civic engagement are critical tools in the defense of tolerance. When intolerance is exposed early, when its logic is challenged, its language deconstructed, and its intentions laid bare, it loses much of its power. Sunlight, as the saying goes, is the best disinfectant. Still, The paradox forces us to recognize that there are limits. Tolerance is not a weakness, it is a principled stance rooted in compassion and reason. But like any value, it must be defended. A society that is unwilling to confront intolerance out of fear, politeness, or philosophical confusion risks losing the very freedom it cherishes. This is not a call for authoritarian control or blanket censorship. It is a call for discernment, courage, and clarity. It is a reminder that not all ideas deserve equal platforms, that some beliefs are not merely different, they are dangerous, and that the preservation of tolerance sometimes demands difficult choices. There is also a psychological layer to the paradox. Tolerance requires emotional maturity. It requires the ability to hold space for disagreement without feeling threatened. But when intolerance enters the picture, it targets that very capacity. It provokes, polarizes, and manipulates. It turns openness against itself. The paradox is not just logical, it is emotional. It plays on our deepest fears and values. And that's why it's so hard to resolve. In the modern world, this paradox plays out in social media debates, political movements, and institutional policies. We see it in debates over platforming controversial figures, in legal battles over speech, and in cultural conflicts over inclusion. Each case is different, and the boundaries are not always clear. But the guiding principle remains: tolerance must be defended against those who would use it to destroy others. The paradox of tolerance is not a flaw in the idea of a free society. It is a test of its strength. It challenges us to uphold tolerance not as blind acceptance, but as a living principle, one that includes, protects, and when necessary, resists. It asks us to be open-hearted but not naive, to be generous but not passive, and to remember that the price of a tolerant society is eternal vigilance against the intolerance that would undo it from within. Moore's Paradox. It's raining, but I don't believe it is. Sounds illogical, but grammatically fine. At first glance, there's nothing grammatically wrong with the sentence, "It's raining, but I don't believe it is." Every word is in its proper place. The sentence follows the rules of syntax and grammar. And yet, when you hear it aloud, or say it to yourself, something feels deeply off. It strikes you as absurd or contradictory, even though no formal rule of language has been broken. This strange tension between structure and meaning is the heart of Moore's Paradox, named after the British philosopher G.E. Moore, who first articulated the problem in the early 20th century. The paradox is not about external contradiction. It's not saying it's raining and it's not raining, which is a clear logical inconsistency. Instead, the contradiction is pragmatic and psychological. It lies in the speaker's relationship to what is being said, not in the content of the statement itself. When someone says, "It's raining, but I don't believe it is," they are, on one level, asserting a fact, while simultaneously denying that they believe it to be true. The first part presents a claim about the world. The second part presents the speaker's mental state. Taken independently, both can be true, but taken together, they create a jarring dissonance that defies our expectations of sincerity and coherence. Moore identified this paradox in a series of lectures and essays in the 1940s. He wasn't interested in the grammatical form of the sentence, but rather in the peculiar feeling that arises when we try to assert it. The sentence is not self-contradictory in the way that A is not A is, and yet when spoken, it seems impossible to assert honestly. Moore's insight was that while the sentence may be logically valid, it fails to fulfill the norms of assertion, the unwritten rules about what it means to say something meaningfully and sincerely. In ordinary communication, when you make a statement, you're typically expected to believe what you're saying. That's one of the foundational principles of how we understand speech acts. If I say, "The sky is blue," it implies that I believe the sky is blue. If I say, "The train arrives at 6 p.m., I'm communicating not only the time, but also my belief in that claim. So when a person says, "It's raining, but I don't believe it's raining," they're undermining their own credibility in real time. They are saying something that defeats itself. not logically, but functionally. This is what makes Moore's paradox so interesting to philosophers and linguists. It reveals a subtle but powerful layer of language, the presuppositions and commitments behind our words. When we speak, we're not just conveying information, we're revealing our mental states, our beliefs, and our intentions. Moore's sentence violates this invisible contract. It asks us to believe that someone can assert something while denying belief in it, a disconnect that short-circuits the normal workings of communication. But it gets even stranger. Moore's paradox also applies in other forms. Consider statements like, "It's not raining, but I believe it is," or "That painting is beautiful, but I don't believe it's beautiful." These are just as unsettling. The paradox doesn't depend on the truth of the statement, but on the incompatibility between belief and assertion. The speaker is caught in a kind of cognitive dissonance, openly declaring a reality while simultaneously disavowing their own trust in that reality. Philosophers have explored this puzzle through the lens of epistemology, the study of knowledge and belief. One question it raises is, what does it mean to believe something? Is belief just a mental attitude, or does it come with a commitment to act, speak, and reason accordingly? If someone says, "I believe it's raining," that belief is expected to influence their behavior, carrying an umbrella, checking the forecast, and warning others. But if someone says, "It's raining, but I don't believe it," they are denying the very connection between knowledge and action. They are, in effect, sabotaging their own epistemic authority. This has implications for how we think about self-acknowledge. Moore's paradox challenges the idea that we always have privileged access to our own beliefs. If you can say, "I believe it's raining," but be wrong about your own belief, then belief becomes something more complex than simple introspection. Perhaps belief isn't always transparent to us. Perhaps we can hold contradictory attitudes without fully realizing it. The paradox forces us to confront the fragility of our mental coherence. In psychology, this resonates with the concept of cognitive dissonance, the uncomfortable tension that arises when our actions or statements don't align with our internal beliefs. Moore's paradox captures that tension in a sentence. It reflects the strange moments in life when people do or say things that go against their professed beliefs. When a person expresses love they don't feel, or praises something they don't value. The paradox, then, is not just a linguistic trick, it mirrors a fundamental instability in human psychology. Another way to explore the paradox is through speech-act theory, pioneered by philosophers like J.L. Austin and John Searle. This theory examines the different kinds of actions we perform through language: asserting, promising, questioning, commanding. Each of these acts has conditions for success, what philosophers call felicity conditions. For an assertion to be successful, the speaker must believe the proposition they're asserting. Moore's paradox violates that felicity condition. The sentence fails not because it's false, but because it's incoherent to assert sincerely. You can write it, you can imagine it, but you cannot truthfully say it and believe both parts at once. Interestingly, you can report more in statements about other people. For example, "It's raining and John doesn't believe it is not paradoxical. That sentence can be perfectly reasonable if John is mistaken or uninformed. The paradox only arises when the contradiction is within the same speaker, when one person tries to hold both claims at once. This highlights the first-person nature of belief and assertion. The paradox is tied not just to language, but to the intimate relationship between thought and speech. In practical terms, Moore's paradox sheds light on real-world dilemmas in politics, religion, and ethics. Think of a politician who says, "This policy will help everyone, but I don't believe in it." Or a religious leader who proclaims a doctrine but privately confesses doubt. These aren't hypothetical cases, they're part of the messy reality of human communication. The paradox forces us to ask whether sincerity matters, whether belief should align with speech, and how we interpret the statements of those who speak for others. It also invites us to reflect on self-deception. Is it possible to believe something and not believe it at the same time? To assert a truth while secretly doubting it? Moore's paradox captures the awkwardness of those moments when we pretend to know what we don't, or claim to believe what we secretly question. It is a linguistic representation of internal conflict. Moore's paradox is less about rain and more about the human condition. It reveals the limits of our rationality, the complexity of belief, and the deep connections between language, thought, and self-awarenessness. It teaches us that truth in communication is not just about accuracy, it's about integrity. And it reminds us that what we say cannot be separated from what we believe, at least not without creating a fracture in the act of meaning itself. So while the sentence, "It's raining, but I don't believe it," may pass every grammatical test, it fails as a meaningful assertion. It's a statement that the mouth can form, but the mind cannot stand behind. And in that fragile space between words and belief, between logic and sincerity, Moore's paradox quietly sits, pointing out the strange ways we sometimes speak and the even stranger ways we sometimes think. The sleeping beauty problem. You're woken once or twice depending on a coin toss, but you forget, what are the odds it was heads? Imagine a thought experiment that feels like a fairy tale with a twist. A woman named Sleeping Beauty is told she will take part in a strange experiment. On Sunday, she is put to sleep. A fair coin is tossed once. If the coin lands heads, she will be awakened once, on Monday, and then allowed to leave. If the coin lands tails, she will be awakened twice, once on Monday and once on Tuesday, but with her memory of the first awakening erased before the second. In both cases, every time she wakes up, she is placed in the same room, with no clock, no calendar, and no memory of whether she has been awakened before. Now comes the key question. Each time Sleeping Beauty wakes up, what probability should she assign to the coin having landed heads? It seems like a simple problem. After all, it's just a coin toss, right? 50-50 odds? But as with many philosophical puzzles, simplicity can be deceiving. Once you dive into the reasoning, you discover that two seemingly rational lines of thought lead to two different answers. One says 1/2, the intuitive answer. The other says 1/3, the counterintuitive, yet surprisingly compelling result. This division has sparked an ongoing philosophical debate between two camps, halfers and thirders. To understand both sides, we need to carefully break down the structure of the experiment. First, the coin toss is fair. That means there's a 50% chance of heads and a 50% chance of tails. If it's heads, Beauty wakes up once, on Monday. If it's tails, she wakes up twice, Monday and Tuesday, but with no memory of the first. Each time she wakes up, she has no idea whether it's Monday or Tuesday, or even whether she's already been awake. Now let's consider the halfer position. According to this view, the coin toss happens before she is put to sleep. Beauty knows in advance that the coin is fair, and nothing she learns upon waking gives her any new information about the outcome. From her perspective, waking up is guaranteed no matter what the coin shows. Whether heads or tails, at least one awakening is certain. Since she knew she'd be woken at least once either way, her waking up doesn't update the probability. So, according to the halfer, the chance the coin landed heads remains 1/2. It sounds reasonable. After all, shouldn't she stick to the probability she assigned before going to sleep? The experiment doesn't change the coin, it only affects how often she wakes. The halfer argues that multiplying the number of awakenings should not change the odds of a single fair coin toss. But now let's consider the thirder position. This perspective starts by considering how often she finds herself in different possible situations. Under the rules of the experiment, there are 3 equally likely scenarios for any given awakening. The coin landed heads, and it is Monday. The coin landed tails, and it is Monday. The coin landed tails, and it is Tuesday. If you imagine Beauty waking up and not knowing which of the 3 scenarios she's in, only one corresponds to heads. The other 2, Monday and Tuesday under tails, correspond to tails. So, the chance that she's in a heads world is 1 in 3. Hence, the thirder concludes, the correct answer is 1/3 third. This might seem strange. How can the odds of a fair coin toss not be 50-50? But the thirder argument isn't really about the coin, it's about the observer's perspective. Since Beauty doesn't know what day it is and doesn't remember past awakenings, she must consider all possible awakening scenarios. From that viewpoint, she's twice as likely to find herself in a Tails situation because Tails produces twice as many awakenings. This leads to a deeper insight about self-locating belief, the kind of belief that depends on where and when you find yourself, rather than just external facts. The Sleeping Beauty problem is not just about probability, it's about how identity, memory, and time affect belief. It shows how changing the structure of experience changes the logic of inference. Let's imagine the experiment repeated many times. Suppose Beauty is put through this experiment 1,000 times. In about 500 of those cases, the coin will land heads and she will be woken once. That's 500 awakenings. In the other 500 cases, where it lands tails, she will be woken twice, producing 1-0 awakenings. In total, that's 500 awakenings, 500 under heads, 1-0 under tails. So, from the point of view of a randomly selected awakening, 1 out of 3 occurred under heads and 2 out of 3 under tails. Hence, from this long-run frequency model, the thirder logic seems to make perfect sense. And yet, critics of the thirder position argue that this thinking conflates subjective uncertainty with objective probability. They say that just because she's more likely to find herself in a tails scenario after the fact, that doesn't mean the coin toss itself had unequal chances. It's a difference between the chance of the outcome versus the chance of the experience of the outcome. Some also point out that if you introduce betting into the equation, the thirder reasoning appears more rational. Suppose Beauty is offered a bet each time she wakes. She can bet $1.00 that the coin landed heads, and if she's right, she wins $2.00. If she follows half her logic and bets on heads every time, she ends up losing money in the long run, because she's placing more bets under tails scenarios, which appear more frequently. If she follows the thirder strategy, she bets less frequently on heads, aligning with the actual odds of winning and therefore maximizing her expected payout. This betting scenario gives the thirder view a kind of pragmatic edge. It suggests that probability should not just reflect abstract beliefs, it should guide decisions. And decisions that don't take into account the structure of experience, like how often certain events happen, are likely to fail in practice. But even here, not everyone agrees. The halfer might counter by adjusting the bet size or considering the fairness of the payout scheme, claiming the paradox lies in the betting conditions, not in the underlying probability. This ongoing debate highlights just how slippery the notion of probability can be when it intersects with consciousness and time. What makes the Sleeping Beauty problem so powerful is that it touches on more than just a coin toss. It forces us to question how we understand reality when memory is incomplete, when time is fragmented, and when identity is unstable. It raises the possibility that what we believe depends not just on what is true, but on where and when we are in the structure of events. Some have even drawn parallels between the problem and experiences in quantum mechanics, where observers influence what is measured, or to simulation theory, where multiple instances of conscious beings might exist simultaneously. In all of these frameworks, the question becomes, how do you reason about the world when you don't know your place in it? The Sleeping Beauty problem, then, is not just about a sleeping woman and a fair coin. It is a philosophical mirror that reflects our own uncertainties about knowledge, perspective, and time. It asks us to look beyond surface-level logic and examine how belief is shaped by context. It reminds us that sometimes probability is not just about numbers, it's about the hidden structure behind what we see and remember. So when Sleeping Beauty wakes, groggy and confused, she must weigh more than just a coin. She must weigh the strange architecture of her own experience. And in doing so, she invites us to do the same, to question not only what we know, but how we came to know it, and what we might be forgetting as we open our eyes to a world that always holds more than meets the mind.